never thought I'd be afraid of a man in a hard hat. But here I was, crouched behind my living room curtains, heart pounding, as I watched him circle my house like a vulture eyeing its prey. It started as an ordinary Tuesday. I was working from home, buried in spreadsheets and conference calls, when a flash of yellow caught my eye. Glancing out the window, I saw a man in a utility worker's uniform standing on the sidewalk, clipboard in hand. He seemed to be examining the houses on our street, jotting down notes as he went. I didn't think much of it at first. Utility workers were a common sight in our neighborhood, always checking meters or trimming trees away from power lines. But as the day wore on, I noticed he was still there, lingering far longer than seemed necessary. By mid-afternoon, my curiosity had turned to unease. The man had been out there for hours, his attention focused solely on my house. I watched as he paced back and forth, scribbling furiously on his clipboard. Occasionally, he'd pause to stare at my windows, as if trying to peer inside. I double-checked the calendar on my fridge. No, I hadn't forgotten about any scheduled maintenance. We hadn't reported any issues either. So why was he so fixated on our property? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across my front lawn, I decided to confront him. I stepped outside, plastering on a friendly smile. "Can I help you with something?" I called out. The man's head snapped up, his eyes meeting mine. For a moment, he looked startled, as if he hadn't expected anyone to be home. Then his face smoothed into a bland smile. "Just doing a routine check, ma'am," he replied, his voice oddly flat. Nothing to worry about. But there was plenty to worry about. As he spoke, I noticed his uniform didn't quite fit right. The sleeves were too short, the pants too loose, and there was no company logo on his hat or shirt, just blank yellow fabric. "What company did you say you were with?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He hesitated, just a fraction too long. "City Utilities," he mumbled, already turning away. "Have a good evening, ma'am." I watched him walk away, my skin crawling. Something was very, very wrong. I went back inside, locked the door, and called the utility company. As I suspected, they hadn't sent anyone to our neighborhood. In fact, they had no record of any scheduled work in our area at all. Panic rose in my throat as I hung up the phone. Who was this man, and what did he want? I peered out the window again, hoping he was gone. But there he was, standing at the end of my driveway, staring at my house with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I called the police, my fingers trembling as I dialed. The dispatcher assured me they'd send someone to check it out, but it might be a while. Apparently, there had been a big pileup on the highway, and most officers were tied up with that. So I waited and watched. The sky grew darker, streetlights flickering to life. The man remained, a menacing silhouette against the deepening twilight. He'd given up any pretense of work now, no longer bothering with his clipboard. He just stood there, watching, waiting. I made sure every door and window was locked, drawing all the curtains except for a small gap I could peer through. My phone was clutched in my sweaty palm, 911 pre-dialed and ready to call at a moment's notice. Hours passed. The street grew quiet as my neighbors settled in for the night, oblivious to the silent standoff happening outside. I couldn't take my eyes off him, terrified that if I looked away for even a second, he'd make his move. It was nearing midnight when he finally did. I had just glanced at my phone, checking for updates from the police, when I heard it. A soft scraping sound, coming from the side of the house. My heart leaped into my throat as I realized he was no longer standing in the driveway. Clutching a heavy table lamp as a makeshift weapon, I crept towards the noise. It was coming from the guest bedroom, the one room whose windows I'd forgotten to check earlier. As I approached, I could hear the subtle sounds of someone working at the lock. I pressed myself against the wall next to the door, lamp raised, ready to swing. The scraping stopped, replaced by the soft creak of the window being slowly pushed open. A rush of cool night air brushed my face as the window swung wide. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense as I heard the soft thud of feet landing on the carpet. For a moment, all was silent. Then, a beam of light cut through the darkness as he switched on a flashlight. I could see his shadow, distorted and monstrous, stretching across the floor. He took a step forward, and another. The floorboards creaked under his weight. He was getting closer to the door, closer to where I was hiding. My palms were slick with sweat, the lamp threatening to slip from my grasp. I adjusted my grip, trying to steady my trembling hands. Just a few more steps, and he'd be in range. The door began to open, agonizingly slow. I could see his hand first, then the sleeve of his yellow jacket. As soon as I saw his shoulder, I struck. The lamp connected with a sickening thud. He stumbled backward with a strangled cry, the flashlight flying from his hand and clattering across the floor. I didn't give him a chance to recover. I swung again and again until he collapsed to the ground. Breathing heavily, I fumbled for the light switch. The room flooded with light, revealing the man sprawled on the floor. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead, his eyes closed. The yellow hard hat had rolled into a corner, revealing thinning gray hair. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. This time, the dispatcher promised immediate assistance. As I waited for the police to arrive, I kept a wary eye on the unconscious intruder, the lamp still clutched tightly in my hands. The next few hours passed in a blur of flashing lights and police interviews. They took the man away in an ambulance, still unconscious. As one officer bagged the man's tools as evidence, another sat with me in the kitchen, taking my statement. "You did the right thing," he assured me, his voice kind. "This guy's a known burglar. We've been trying to catch him for months. He likes to pose as utility workers to case houses during the day, then break in at night." Relief washed over me, but it was quickly followed by a wave of nausea. I'd been right to be suspicious, right to be afraid, but how close had I come to becoming another one of his victims? As the police finished up and prepared to leave, the officer paused at my door. "You should think about getting a security system," he suggested, "just in case." I nodded numbly, knowing I wouldn't be able to sleep without one now. As I closed the door behind him, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the hallway mirror. My face was pale, my eyes wide with lingering fear. I hardly recognized myself. I spent the rest of the night sitting in my living room, every light in the house blazing. Sleep was out of the question. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man's face, heard the scrape of tools on my window. As the first light of dawn began to seep through my windows, I finally felt some of the tension leave my body. I'd survived the night. I was safe. But as I walked to the kitchen to make a much-needed cup of coffee, a thought stopped me cold. The officer had said, "We've been trying to catch him for months." Months of this man watching houses, breaking in, terrorizing people like me. How many other women had stood where I stood, watching a stranger watch their homes? How many had felt the same fear, the same helplessness? And how many hadn't been as lucky as I was? I thought about all the times I'd ignored my instincts, brushed off feelings of unease as paranoia. Never again, I vowed. From now on, I would trust my gut, no matter what. As I sipped my coffee, I opened my laptop and began researching security systems. I had work to do, a house to fortify, a sense of safety to rebuild. The man in the hard hat was gone, but I knew there would be others. Next time, I would be ready. The silence of the wilderness was supposed to be peaceful. Instead, it became the soundtrack to my terror as I stared at the strange footprints circling my tent, my breath catching in my throat with each twig snap in the darkness beyond. I'd always been a city girl at heart, more comfortable with the hum of traffic than the chirping of crickets. But when my therapist suggested a solo camping trip to help with my anxiety, I decided to give it a try. "Reconnect with nature," she said. "Find your inner peace." If only she could see me now, huddled in my sleeping bag, jumping at every sound. The day had started well enough. I'd found a beautiful spot by a small stream, far from the designated campgrounds. I wanted solitude, and I'd certainly found it. The sun filtered through the leaves as I set up my tent, humming to myself and feeling proud of my newfound outdoorsiness. As evening fell, I built a small fire, feeling like a regular survivalist as I roasted marshmallows and watched the stars come out. The night was clear, the Milky Way stretching across the sky in a way I'd never seen in the city. Maybe my therapist was onto something after all. I crawled into my tent around midnight, tired but content. The sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, lulled me to sleep. But sometime in the early hours of the morning, I jerked awake, my heart pounding. At first, I couldn't pinpoint what had woken me. Then I heard it, a soft crunching sound like footsteps on leaves. It was close, too close. I held my breath, straining my ears. The footsteps circled my tent slowly, deliberately. This was no curious deer or raccoon. Whatever was out there was big, and it moved with purpose. I wanted to call out, to ask who was there, but fear had frozen my voice. The footsteps completed a circuit around my tent, then stopped right outside the entrance. I could see a shadow through the thin fabric, looming and motionless. Seconds stretched into minutes. I lay there, barely breathing, waiting for something. A voice, more footsteps, the zip of my tent opening. But there was nothing, just that shadow, standing silent and still. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow moved away. I heard the footsteps retreating, fading into the distance. Only when I could no longer hear them did I let out the breath I'd been holding, my body shaking with delayed panic. I wanted to convince myself it had been a dream, a figment of my anxious imagination. But as the first light of dawn began to seep through my tent, I knew I had to face whatever was out there. With trembling hands, I unzipped the tent and peeked out. The forest looked peaceful in the early morning light, birds beginning their dawn chorus. For a moment, I felt foolish for my fear. Then I looked down, footprints. Large, distinctly human footprints circled my tent. They weren't there when I'd gone to sleep. My blood ran cold as I followed their path with my eyes, seeing how they led right up to my tent's entrance before moving away again. Someone had been here, watching me sleep. I scrambled out of the tent, my eyes darting around the clearing. That's when I saw it, a flash of movement between the trees. A figure, dark and indistinct, darting out of sight. "Hey!" I called out, my voice hoarse with fear. "Who's there?" Silence was my only answer, but I knew what I'd seen. Someone was out there, hiding, watching. My hands shook as I tried to break down my tent, my eyes constantly scanning the tree line. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made me flinch. I had to get out of here, back to my car, back to civilization. In my haste, I snagged the tent on a root, ripping a long tear in the fabric. Any other time, I would have been upset about damaging my expensive gear. Now, I couldn't care less. I stuffed everything haphazardly into my backpack, not bothering to pack properly. As I shouldered my bag and turned to leave, I saw it again. A shadow moving between the trees, closer this time. I caught a glimpse of pale skin, of eyes reflecting the early morning light. I ran. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I had a vague idea of which direction I'd come from yesterday, but in my panic, all the trees looked the same. I could hear something moving in the forest behind me, keeping pace. It wasn't trying to catch me, not yet. It was hurting me, I realized with growing horror. Whenever I tried to veer left or right, I'd hear movement from that direction, forcing me back on course. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't dare stop. I broke through a line of trees and found myself in another clearing. For a moment, hope surged through me. This was where I'd parked my car, but as I looked around wildly, my hope turned to ash. This wasn't the same clearing. There was no car, no road, nothing but more trees and untouched wilderness. I spun around, trying to get my bearing, when I saw them. 3 figures stood at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden by the trees. They were human in shape, but something about their posture, the way they stood unnaturally still, sent chills down my spine. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "What do you want?" They didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there watching. I backed away slowly, my eyes never leaving them. My back hit a tree, rough bark scraping my skin through my thin t-shirt. I was trapped. The figures began to move forward, emerging from the shadows of the forest. I could see them clearly now, and I almost wished I couldn't. Their clothes were tattered and filthy, hanging off emaciated frames. Their skin was pale, almost gray, stretched tight over jutting bones. But it was their eyes that made my blood run cold. They were too wide, too bright, filled with a feral hunger that was anything but human. A scream built in my throat, but before it could escape, a hand clamped over my mouth from behind. I hadn't even heard anyone approach. "Quiet," a voice hissed in my ear. "Unless you want them to hear." I froze, torn between the threat in front of me and the unseen person behind me. The hand slowly lifted from my mouth. "Who?" I began to ask, but the voice cut me off. "No time. Follow me if you want to live." The owner of the voice stepped into view. It was a man or older, with a wild beard and clothes that had seen better days. He looked like he belonged in the wilderness, but his eyes were kind, sane. He held out his hand to me. I glanced back at the approaching figures, then at the man's outstretched hand. I didn't have much choice. I took it. He pulled me into the trees, moving with a silent grace I couldn't hope to match. I stumbled after him, wincing at every snapping twig under my feet. But he seemed to know where to step, how to move without making a sound. We ran for what felt like hours, the man leading me through the forest with unerring confidence. Eventually, we reached a small cabin, so well hidden among the trees I wouldn't have seen it if we weren't right on top of it. The man ushered me inside, quickly barring the door behind us. Only then did he turn to me, his face grave. "You're lucky I found you," he said. "Those things, they've been hunting these woods for months now. Campers, hikers, anyone they can get their hands on." "What are they?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head. "I don't know. They showed up after that big storm last winter. Been here ever since. They're smart, cunning, and they're always hungry." I sank into a chair, my legs finally giving out. How do we get out of here?" "We wait," he said, moving to the window and peering out. "They don't like the sunlight much. Once it's high noon, we make a run for it. I know a safe path out of these woods." As if on cue, an inhuman shriek echoed through the forest. I flinched, but the man didn't even blink. "They're angry they lost you," he said. "But they won't come here. This place is safe." I nodded, too exhausted and terrified to question him. As the adrenaline wore off, the events of the morning crashed over me. I began to shake, delayed shock setting in. The man noticed and draped a worn but clean blanket over my shoulders. "Rest," he said gently. "You're safe now. I'll wake you when it's time to go." As I drifted off into an uneasy sleep, I couldn't help but wonder about this man. How long had he been out here? How many others had he saved? And most importantly, would we really be safe when we left the cabin? Somehow, I had a feeling my ordeal was far from over. The forest had shown me its secrets, and I knew I'd never look at the wilderness the same way again. My last thought before sleep took me was of my therapist. "Reconnect with nature," she'd said. Well, I'd certainly done that, but this connection was one I'd spend the rest of my life trying to forget. The moment I saw his thumb jutting out from the roadside, I knew I'd regret stopping. But loneliness makes fools of us all, and I was the biggest fool that night. The highway stretched before me, an endless ribbon of asphalt cutting through the darkness. I'd been driving for hours, the monotony of the journey broken only by the occasional flicker of my headlights catching a road sign or the eyes of some nocturnal creature. It was nearing midnight, and I was still hours away from home. The radio had long since devolved into static, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the hypnotic hum of tires on pavement. That's probably why I noticed him so quickly. Any change in the landscape was a welcome distraction from the mind-numbing boredom of the drive. He was standing on the shoulder, arm outstretched, thumb raised in the universal signal of a hitchhiker. As I drew closer, my headlights illuminated him fully. He looked ordinary enough, mid-30s, jeans and a worn jacket, a small backpack at his feet. His face wore a hopeful expression as I approached. I should have kept driving. Every instinct, every late-night news story, every warning from my parents screamed at me to press on the gas and leave him in my rearview mirror. But something made me slow down. Maybe it was the lateness of the hour, or the emptiness of the road. Maybe it was just simple human compassion. Whatever the reason, I found myself pulling onto the shoulder, gravel crunching under my tires as I came to a stop. The man jogged up to my passenger window, a grateful smile on his face. I rolled down the window, just a crack. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Next town over, if that's all right," he replied. His voice was pleasant, with a slight southern drawl. "Name's Mike. I appreciate you stopping. Not many folks would this time of night." I hesitated for a moment, then reached over and unlocked the passenger door. "Hop in," I said, immediately wondering if I was making a huge mistake. Mike settled into the seat beside me, his backpack between his feet. "Thanks again," he said as I pulled back onto the highway. "My car broke down a few miles back. Couldn't get a signal on my phone out here." I nodded, keeping my eyes on the road. "No problem. It's a lonely stretch. Couldn't just leave you out there." We drove in silence for a few minutes. I could feel Mike glancing at me occasionally, but I kept my gaze forward. The silence grew uncomfortable, so I cleared my throat. "So, what brings you out this way?" Mike shifted in his seat. "Oh, just passing through, visiting family." Something about the way he said it made me glance over. His eyes met mine, and for a split second I saw something there that made my blood run cold. It was gone in an instant, replaced by a friendly smile. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. I turned back to the road, my hands tightening on the steering wheel. "Must be nice," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Visiting family, I mean." Mike hummed in agreement. "Oh yes, very nice. They're always so welcoming." The way he emphasized the last word sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, that the late hour and the strangeness of the situation were playing tricks on my mind. But then I noticed Mike's hand. It was resting on the seat between us, and it was clenched into a tight fist. His knuckles were white, the tendons standing out on the back of his hand. It was the hand of someone barely containing some powerful emotion, rage, or excitement, or both. My heart began to race. I needed to get him out of my car, but we were miles from anywhere. No houses, no gas stations, nothing but empty fields and darkness on either side of the highway. "So," Mike said, his voice suddenly much closer. I realized he had leaned towards me. "You always pick up strangers in the middle of the night?" I swallowed hard. "Not usually, no. Guess I'm just a good Samaritan." Mike chuckled, a low, humorless sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Good Samaritan. I like that. Where I come from, we have a saying about good Samaritans." I didn't want to ask Hans, but I heard myself speak anyway. "What's that?" "We say they're usually the easiest marks." The change in his voice was immediate and terrifying. Gone was the friendly southern drawl, replaced by a cold, hard edge that left no doubt about his intentions. I felt something press against my side. I didn't need to look to know it was a knife. "Here's what's going to happen," Mike said, his voice eerily calm. "You're going to keep driving until I tell you to stop. Then you're going to give me your wallet, your phone, and your car keys. If you do exactly as I say, you might just walk away from this. Understand?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. My mind was racing, trying to figure a way out of this nightmare. There were no other cars on the road, no one to signal for help. Even if there were, how could I alert them without Mike noticing? We drove on in tense silence, the knife a constant pressure against my ribs. I kept waiting for headlights to appear behind us, for some miraculous rescue, but the road remained empty. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Mike spoke again. "Turn off here," he said, nodding towards an approaching exit. I hesitated. The exit led to a dark, tree-lined road. If I turned off the highway, any slim chance of help would vanish. The knife pressed harder. I said, "Turn off." Swallowing my fear, I flicked on my turn signal and took the exit. The new road was narrow and winding, the trees on either side forming a dark tunnel. My headlights seemed feeble against the pressing darkness. "Stop the car," Mike ordered after we'd gone about a mile down this new road. I eased onto the brake, bringing the car to a stop on the shoulder. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure Mike could hear it. "Now, give me your wallet and phone." Slowly. With trembling hands, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my wallet. I handed it to him, then retrieved my phone from the cup holder and passed that over too. Mike pocketed both items, the knife never wavering from my side. Good. Now the keys. This was it. Once I handed over the keys, I'd have nothing left. No way to escape, no way to call for help. I'd be at his mercy in the middle of nowhere. As I reached for the ignition, a plan, desperate and dangerous, formed in my mind. It was probably stupid, definitely risky, but it was all I had. I turned the key, killing the engine. But instead of removing it, I suddenly slammed my hand down on the horn. The blaring noise shattered the silence of the night. Mike, startled by the sudden sound, jerked back. In that moment of distraction, I threw open my door and tumbled out of the car. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me, but adrenaline and fear propelled me forward. I scrambled to my feet and ran, plunging into the dark woods beside the road. Behind me, I heard Mike cursing, the car door slamming, then footsteps crashing through the underbrush. He was coming after me. I ran blindly through the trees, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. I had no idea where I was going, no plan beyond on away from Mike, away from the knife, away from the terror that gripped my heart. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in that dark forest. But eventually, I burst through the tree line and found myself on another road. This one was wider, better maintained, and in the distance I could see lights, civilization, safety. I ran towards those lights like my life depended on it, because it did. As I got closer, I realized it was a truck stop. Never in my life had I been so happy to see a gas station and a cheap diner. I burst through the door of the diner, startling the few patrons inside. "Please," I gasped, struggling to catch my breath. "I need help. Someone's after me." The next few hours passed in a blur. Police were called, statements were taken, search parties were sent out, but they never found Mike. It was like he had vanished into the night, taking my wallet, my phone, and my sense of security with him. As I sat in the police station, a shock blanket around my shoulders, I couldn't stop shaking. Not just from the cold or the adrenaline crash, but from the realization of how close I'd come to. I didn't even want to think about what might have happened. The detective taking my statement laid a gentle hand on my arm. "You're safe now," she said softly. "You did good. You survived." I nodded, but I knew the truth. I might have escaped. But a part of me was still out there in those dark woods, running for my life. And I knew that every time I got behind the wheel, every time I saw a hitchhiker on the side of the road, I'd remember this night. I'd remember Mike, and the moment his mask slipped, revealing the predator beneath. And I'd remember the lesson I'd learned the hard way. Sometimes, the real monsters don't hide under your bed. Sometimes, they sit right beside you, with a friendly smile and a hidden knife, just waiting for their chance. The moment my fingers brushed against that hidden latch, I knew I'd stumbled onto something I was never meant to find. But curiosity is a powerful force, and as I heard those heavy footsteps descending the stairs, I realized it might just be the death of me. It was supposed to be a simple favor for a friend. Sarah had asked me to house sit for her while she was away on a 2-week business trip. Just water the plants, feed the cat, and make sure the place doesn't burn down, she'd said with a laugh. Easy enough, I thought. The first few days were uneventful. Sarah's cat, Mr. Whiskers, was standoffish but manageable. The plants were all still alive. I spent most of my time working on my laptop or binge-watching shows on Sarah's impressive TV setup. It wasn't until the 4th night that things took a turn for the strange. I was in the kitchen, rummaging through the fridge for a midnight snack, when I heard it. A soft thud like something heavy being dropped, coming from somewhere below me. At first, I dismissed it. Old houses make noises, right? But then I heard it again, louder this time. It was definitely coming from beneath the house. I knew Sarah's place had a basement. I'd seen the door next to the kitchen when I first arrived, but she told me there was nothing down there except old junk, and that I wouldn't need to go down for any reason. Curiosity piqued. I approached the basement door. It was locked, which struck me as odd. Who locks a basement door in their own home? I tried to push the thought aside, to go back to bed and forget about it. But the noises continued, soft but persistent. Before I knew what I was doing, I was searching for the key. I found it on top of the door frame, hidden behind a layer of dust. My hand trembled slightly as I inserted it into the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a set of steep stairs descending into darkness. I flicked the light switch, but nothing happened. Great. I pulled out my phone, turning on the flashlight app, and began my descent. The basement was cluttered, just as Sarah had said. Boxes piled high, old furniture draped in sheets, the usual basement stuff. But as I swept my phone's light across the room, something caught my eye. A section of the wall looked different. The paint was fresher, newer than the rest. I approached it, running my hand along the surface. That's when I felt it, a small, almost imperceptible bump. A hidden latch. My heart raced as I pressed it. There was a soft click, and a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a small, secret room. The beam of my flashlight illuminated a scene that made my blood run cold. The room was tiny, no bigger than a closet. But it was what was in the room that horrified me. The walls were covered in photographs, hundreds of them, overlapping, creating a disturbing collage. They were all of people, men, women, children, in various states of distress. Some were clearly taken without the subject's knowledge. Others, I couldn't bear to look at too closely. In the center of the room was a small table. On it lay a journal, open to a page filled with cramped, frenzied writing. I leaned in closer, my eyes widening as I read. Subject 27 lasted longer than expected. Notes on improved technique. I slammed the journal shut, my stomach churning. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be Sarah's. Sweet, funny Sarah who baked cookies for the neighborhood kids and volunteered at the animal shelter. It had to be some sick joke, or maybe I was dreaming. But I knew, deep down, that this was all too real. I was so absorbed in my horrified thoughts that I almost missed it, the sound of a key turning in a lock upstairs. My blood turned to ice. Sarah wasn't due back for another week and a half. I hadn't invited anyone over, which meant heavy footsteps on the floor above, slow, deliberate. They paused at the top of the basement stairs. I panicked. I couldn't go back the way I came. Whoever was up there would see me, but I couldn't stay in this tiny room either. I was trapped, The footsteps began descending the stairs. Slow, agonizing. Each step made the old wood creak and groan. I looked around frantically, searching for somewhere, anywhere to hide. The room was too small, too exposed. My eyes landed on a large wardrobe in the main part of the basement. It was my only chance. I slipped out of the secret room, carefully closing the hidden door behind me. As quietly as I could, I crept towards the wardrobe. Each step felt like an eternity, the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. I reached the wardrobe and yanked open the door, wincing at the slight squeak of its hinges. I climbed inside, pulling the door closed just as the basement lights flickered on. Through a small crack, I could see a figure reach the bottom of the stairs. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered. He wasn't Sarah, that was for sure. He moved with purpose, heading straight for the hidden room. I held my breath as he passed by my hiding spot. From my vantage point, I could see his face. It was no one I recognized, but his expression sent chills down my spine. His eyes were cold, calculating, the eyes of a predator. He reached the hidden door and pressed the latch. As it swung open, he paused. Something was wrong. He bent down, examining the floor. When he straightened up, he was holding something. With a jolt of terror, I realized what it was, a long strand of my hair. The man's posture changed instantly. He became alert, tense, like a hunting dog that's caught a scent. His head swiveled, scanning the basement. I shrank back further into the wardrobe, praying he wouldn't notice the slightly ajar door. He began to move around the basement, checking behind boxes, under sheets. Each step brought him closer to my hiding spot. I could hear him breathing now, sharp and excited. He was enjoying this, I realized with horror. The thrill of the hunt, just as I thought he was about to discover me. A loud crash came from upstairs. The man froze, then quickly made his way back to the stairs. He flicked off the lights and ascended, leaving me in darkness once more. I waited, hardly daring to breathe, for what felt like hours. The house above was silent. Had he left? Was it safe to come out? Slowly, carefully, I pushed open the wardrobe door. The basement was dark and still. I crept towards the stairs, my phone's flashlight illuminating the way. Each step felt like a gamble. Would this be the one that creaked and gave me away? I made it to the top of the stairs and pressed my ear against the door. Nothing. Gathering my courage, I turned the knob and pushed it open. The kitchen was empty. So was the living room. I moved through the house like a ghost, checking each room, terrified of what, or who, I might find. But the house was empty. The front door was slightly ajar, explaining the crash I'd heard earlier. Mr. Whiskers must have knocked something over in his escape. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my keys and wallet and ran for my car. As I peeled out of the driveway, I saw a figure step out from behind a tree across the street. The man from the basement. He watched me drive away, and even from a distance I could see the smile on his face. A promise. This wasn't over. I drove straight to the police station. The officers listened to my story with increasing alarm. They sent units to Sarah's house immediately, but I knew they wouldn't find anything. The man would be long gone, and I suspected the secret room would be empty too. In the days that followed, my world turned upside down. Sarah was brought in for questioning. She denied everything, of course. Claimed she knew nothing about the secret room or the man, but the evidence was mounting against her. As for me, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow held a potential threat. Every stranger on the street could be him. The man from the basement. The one who had smiled at me like our encounter was just the beginning. I knew I should feel relieved. The truth had come out. A dangerous person had been caught, but all I felt was a deep, gnawing fear. Because I knew something the police didn't. I had seen the look in that man's eyes. This was a game to him, and it was far from over. Every night, I double-checked my locks. Every morning, I scanned the street before leaving my house. And every day I wonder, when will I see him again? And what will happen when I do? The basement may be behind me, but its shadows still linger, and somewhere out there, a predator waits, ready to step out of those shadows once more. The knock came at midnight, 3 sharp raps that cut through the silence of my empty house. I froze, remote in hand, the late-night movie forgotten as I stared at the front door. Who could be calling at this hour? And why did the sound fill me with such inexplicable dread? I'd always been a bit of a night owl, preferring the quiet solitude of the wee hours to the hustle and bustle of daytime. My job as a freelance graphic designer allowed me this luxury, and I'd grown accustomed to the rhythm of my nocturnal lifestyle. But this was different. Setting down the remote, I cautiously approached the door. Through the peephole, I could see a small figure standing on my porch. The porch light cast a harsh glow, and it took my eyes a moment to adjust. When they did, I felt my breath catch in my throat. It was a young girl, maybe 9 or 10 years old. She was soaked to the bone, her blonde hair plastered to her face. But it wasn't her bedraggled appearance that sent a chill down my spine. It was her eyes. Even through the distortion of the peephole, I could see they were wide, too wide, and they didn't blink. "Please let me in," she called, her voice high and trembling. It sounded rehearsed somehow, like she was reading from a script. I stood frozen, my hand on the doorknob. Every instinct screamed at me not to open the door, but how could I leave a child out in the rain? What if she was in trouble? "Are you okay?" I called through the door. "Where are your parents?" "Please," she repeated, ignoring my questions. "I'm cold. Let me in." Something was very, very wrong. Her voice didn't match her appearance. It was too controlled, too even for a child who should be panicking in this situation. "I'm calling the police," I said, reaching for my phone. "They'll help you find your parents." As I dialed, I kept my eye on the peephole. The girl's expression didn't change. She didn't react to my words at all. She just stood there, staring at the door with those unnaturally wide eyes. The 911 operator answered, and I quickly explained the situation. They promised to send a car to check it out, but advised me not to open the door in the meantime. As I hung up, the girl spoke again. "Let me in," she said, but this time her voice was different, lower, harder. The pretense of a scared child was gone. "Let me in now." A chill ran down my spine. This was no lost child. Whatever was on my porch, it wasn't human. At least, not entirely. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding. The girl, or whatever it was, began to knock again. The sound was no longer the timid rapping of small fists. It was heavy, insistent. The door shook in its frame. "Let me in." The voice was changing, deepening with each word. "You can't keep me out forever." I retreated to the living room, grabbing my laptop on the way. With shaking hands, I began to search online for any similar experiences. To my horror, I found dozens of accounts. All described the same thing: a child at the door late at night, begging to be let in. Those who opened their doors were never heard from again. The pounding at the door grew louder. I could hear wood splintering. Whatever was out there, it was trying to break in. I ran to the kitchen, frantically searching for a weapon. I settled on a large knife, though I had no idea if it would be effective against whatever this was. A crash from the front of the house told me the door had given way. Heavy footsteps echoed through the house. They didn't sound like they belonged to a child anymore. I pressed myself against the kitchen wall, knife clutched to my chest. The footsteps grew closer. A shadow fell across the kitchen threshold. What stepped into view made my blood run cold. It was no longer the little girl from the porch. The creature before me was tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over an angular frame. But its face was still that of the little girl, though distorted now. The eyes were even wider, black and bottomless. The mouth was stretched into an unnatural grin filled with needle-sharp teeth. "Found you," it said, its voice a horrifying mix of child and monster. I didn't think. I just acted. I lunged forward, slashing with the knife. The blade connected, but instead of blood, a thick black ichor oozed from the wound. The creature howled, more in anger than pain. It lashed out, its arm elongating impossibly to swipe at me. I ducked, feeling the air whoosh above my head. I scrambled past it, heading for the front door. If I could just get outside, but it was faster. It cut me off, blocking the exit. "No leaving," it growled. "You're mine now." I was trapped. My mind raced, searching for a way out. Then I remembered something I'd read online. One account had mentioned salt. It was a long shot, but I was out of options. I dove for the kitchen, the creature hot on my heels. I yanked open a cabinet, my hand closing around the container of salt just as I felt cold fingers grasp my shoulder. I spun around, flinging salt directly into its face. The effect was immediate and shocking. The creature reeled back, shrieking in agony. Where the salt touched, its skin sizzled and smoked. I didn't waste the opportunity. I ran, salt clutched in one hand, knife in the other. I made it to the front door and out into the night. The rain had stopped, and the street was eerily quiet. Behind me, I heard the creature's enraged howl. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, not daring to look back. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly. Only then did I slow down, gasping for breath. I found myself in the town center. The 24-hour diner was open, a beacon of normalcy in this nightmare. I stumbled inside, collapsing into a booth. The waitress looked at me with concern, probably taking in my wild eyes and the knife I was still clutching. "Honey, are you okay?" she asked, approaching cautiously. I opened my mouth to respond, to tell her everything, but the words wouldn't come. How could I explain what had just happened? Who would believe me? I'm fine, I managed to say. Just had a scare. Can I use your phone? I need to call the police. She nodded, handing me the diner's cordless phone. As I dialed, I glanced out the window. For a moment, I thought I saw a pale face peering out from behind a parked car, eyes wide and unblinking. But when I looked again, it was gone. The police arrived quickly. I gave them a sanitized version of events, leaving out the supernatural elements. I told them an intruder had broken into my home, that I had managed to fight them off and escape. They took my statement and promised to check out my house. I spent the rest of the night in the diner, jumping at every sound, flinching at every shadow. When dawn finally broke, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Whatever that thing was, I had a feeling it couldn't operate in daylight. The police called to inform me that they had found signs of a break-in at my house, but no intruder. They advised me to stay with friends or family while they investigated further. I nodded numbly, knowing I could never return to that house. I didn't know what that creature was or why it had chosen me, but I knew this wasn't over. It was still out there, waiting. As I left the diner, I caught sight of my reflection in the window. I looked haggard, with dark circles under my eyes and a haunted expression. But what made my blood run cold was what I saw behind me. There, across the street, stood a little girl. She was dry now, her blonde hair neatly combed. She smiled at me, her eyes wide and unblinking. As I watched, her grin widened, revealing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. I blinked, and she was gone. But I knew the truth. This was far from over. The creature had my scent now, and it wouldn't stop until it had me. I walked away from the diner on shaky legs, unsure of where to go or what to do next. One thing was certain, I would never again answer a knock at the door after midnight. Some visitors, once invited, never truly leave. The rusty door creaked open, revealing a darkness so thick it seemed to swallow our flashlight beams. We should have turned back right then, but the thrill of urban exploration, the promise of a great story to tell, pushed us forward. We had no idea we were walking into a nightmare. It was Jake's idea to explore the abandoned warehouse. He'd always been the adventurous one in our group, always pushing us to try new things, to seek out the next adrenaline rush. When he showed us the online forum post about the old Riverside manufacturing plant, his eyes gleamed with excitement. "Come on, guys," he pleaded. "It'll be epic. Think of the photos we could get." Sarah, ever the voice of reason, argued against it. "It's trespassing, Jake. We could get in serious trouble." But Mike and I were already sold on the idea. The prospect of exploring a piece of forgotten history was too tempting to pass up. In the end, Sarah reluctantly agreed to come along, if only to keep us idiots from getting ourselves killed. We chose a Friday night for our adventure. The warehouse was on the outskirts of town, far from prying eyes. As we approached in Jake's beat-up Jeep, the building loomed before us, a hulking shadow against the night sky. "Creepy," Mike muttered, voicing what we were all thinking. We parked a block away and approached on foot, our excitement mingling with a growing sense of unease. The chain-link fence surrounding the property was rusted and bent, easy enough to slip through. The main entrance was boarded up, but Jake quickly found a side door that yielded to his lock-picking skills, and then we were in. The air inside was stale, thick with dust and the musty smell of abandonment. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing peeling paint, broken machinery, and years of neglect. We moved slowly, our footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. "This place is huge," Sarah whispered, her earlier reluctance giving way to awe. We explored the ground floor, snapping photos and marveling at the remnants of the factory's past. Old assembly lines, rusted tools, even faded posters still clinging to the walls. It was like stepping back in time. It wasn't until we reached the back of the warehouse that things started to feel off. I noticed it first, a strange smell cutting through the mustiness, something chemical, almost medicinal. "Do you guys smell that?" I asked, wrinkling my nose. Jake sniffed the air. "Yeah, weird. Maybe some chemicals left over from when this place was operational." We followed the scent, curiosity overriding caution. It led us to a heavy metal door, partially hidden behind some old crates. The smell was stronger here, seeping through the cracks around the door frame. Jake reached for the handle, but Sarah grabbed his arm. "Wait," she hissed. "Listen." We fell silent, straining our ears. At first, I heard nothing but the settling of the old building. Then, faintly, I caught it. Voices, coming from behind the door. My heart began to race. We weren't alone. "We should go," Mike whispered, fear evident in his voice. But before we could move, the voices grew louder. Footsteps approached the door from the other side. We scrambled to hide, ducking behind a cluster of old machinery just as the door swung open. 2 men stepped out. In the dim light, I could make out dark clothing and what looked like gas masks covering their faces. They were carrying large duffel bags. "That's the last of it," one of them said, his voice muffled by the mask. "Let's get out of here before the next shift arrives." They walked past our hiding spot, oblivious to our presence. We held our breath, pressing ourselves against the cold metal of the machines. As soon as they were out of sight, we heard the distant sound of a vehicle starting up. "What the hell was that?" Mike whispered once we were sure they were gone. "I don't know," Jake replied, "but I'm going to find out." Before any of us could stop him, he was moving towards the door the men had come through. "Jake, no!" Sarah hissed, but he was already pushing it open. The smell hit us like a wall. It was overwhelming, a mix of chemicals that made my eyes water. Beyond the door was a large room, filled with tables and strange equipment. It looked like some kind of makeshift laboratory. "Oh my God," Sarah gasped. Is this a drug lab?" It certainly seemed that way. The tables were covered in beakers, Bunsen burners, and what looked like piles of white powder. In the corner, large plastic barrels were stacked, labeled with skull and crossbones symbols. "We need to get out of here," Mike said, his voice shaking. "Right now." But Jake was already exploring, his camera out, snapping pictures. "Do you guys realize what we've stumbled onto? This is huge." "It's hugely dangerous," I countered. "Jake, we're in way over our heads. We need to leave and call the cops." He turned to argue, but his reply was cut short by a new sound. Voices, again, but this time, they were coming from the main part of the warehouse. The next shift the men had mentioned must have arrived. Panic set in. We were trapped. "Quick, turn off the flashlights," Sarah whispered. We plunged into darkness, the only light now coming from the faint glow of emergency exit signs. The voices grew closer. I could make out at least 3 distinct speakers. "Check the lab. Make sure everything's set for the next batch," one voice commanded. Footsteps approached our hiding spot. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they'd hear it. I felt Sarah's hand grab mine, squeezing tight. The door creaked open. A beam of light swept across the room. We pressed ourselves against the wall, hardly daring to breathe. The light passed over us once, twice, and then a phone rang. The sudden noise made us all jump. It was coming from Jake's pocket. In our panic, he'd forgotten to silence it. "What was that?" one of the men shouted. "There's someone in here." Everything happened fast after that. Jake bolted, shoving past the man in the doorway. We had no choice but to follow. I heard shouts behind us, the sound of pursuit. We ran blindly through the warehouse, dodging around old equipment and piles of debris. I could hear our pursuers gaining on us. They knew the layout better than we did. "The side door," Sarah gasped. "It's our only chance." We changed course, heading for where we'd entered. Behind us, I heard the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked. These men were serious, and we were in real danger. Jake reached the door first, yanking it open. We spilled out into the cool night air, gasping and stumbling, but we couldn't stop. We ran for Jake's Jeep, the shouts of our pursuers echoing behind us. We piled in, Jake fumbling with the keys. Come on," he muttered. The engine roared to life just as dark figures emerged from the warehouse. Jake floored it, tires screeching as we peeled away. In the rearview mirror, I saw a man raise his arm, pointing something at us. A sharp crack split the air, and the rear window shattered. "Get down," Mike yelled. We ducked low in our seats as Jake swerved, taking corners at breakneck speed. It wasn't until we were on the highway, the warehouse far behind us, that we finally started to breathe again. What do we do now?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "We go to the police," I said firmly. "We tell them everything." Jake nodded, his earlier bravado gone. "I'm so sorry, guys. I had no idea." We spent hours at the police station, giving statements, describing what we'd seen. The officers were intensely interested in the lab we'd discovered. By morning, we heard that a major drug bust had been made at the warehouse, with several arrests. We were hailed as heroes by some, reckless idiots by others. Our parents grounded us for months. But we didn't care about any of that. We were just grateful to be alive. That night changed us. The thrill of urban exploration lost its appeal, replaced by a newfound appreciation for safety and lawfulness. We'd gone looking for adventure and nearly found tragedy instead. As I lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, I couldn't shake the image of those men in the warehouse, or the sound of gunshots ringing out in the dark. We'd been so naive, thinking abandoned places were just empty relics of the past. But we'd learned a hard truth. Sometimes the most dangerous things lurk in the places we think are deserted. The next time Jake suggested an adventure, we all had the same response. Let's just go to the movies instead. The first drop of blood on the motel carpet should have been my cue to run. Instead, I stood there, frozen, as the stain grew larger and my world spiraled into a nightmare I never saw coming. It was supposed to be a quick overnight stay, just a pit stop on my long drive cross-country. I'd been on the road for hours, my eyes heavy with fatigue, when I saw the neon vacancy sign of the Starlight Motel flickering in the distance. It wasn't much to look at, a single-story building with peeling paint and a nearly empty parking lot. But at that moment, it looked like heaven. The lobby was deserted when I walked in, save for a bored-looking clerk who barely looked up from his phone as he handed me a key. "Room 13, he muttered. "End of the row." I should have known better than to accept a room number so universally associated with bad luck, but I was too tired to care. I just wanted a bed and a few hours of sleep before hitting the road again. Room 13 was about what I expected, shabby but clean enough, with faded floral wallpaper and a bed that had seen better days. I dropped my bag, kicked off my shoes, and fell into bed, asleep almost before my head hit the pillow. I'm not sure how long I slept before the noises woke me. At first, I thought I was dreaming. Muffled shouts, a thud, the sound of breaking glass. But as I blinked awake, I realized the sounds were coming from the room next door. Probably just a drunk couple fighting, I muttered to myself, pulling the pillow over my head. But the noises continued, growing louder and more frantic. There was another crash, followed by a scream that made my blood run cold. I sat up, fully awake now, my heart pounding. This wasn't just some petty argument. Someone was in trouble. I grabbed my phone, ready to call for help, when suddenly everything went quiet. The silence was somehow worse than the noise had been, heavy with a sense of foreboding that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I crept to the wall, pressing my ear against it, straining to hear something, anything. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, faintly, I heard what sounded like dragging, followed by the creak of a door opening and closing. My mind raced. Should I call the police? Go check it out myself. I was still debating when I heard a soft knock at my own door. Cautiously, I approached, peering through the peephole. The hallway looked empty, but something made me hesitate to open the door. Instead, I called out, "Who's there?" No answer. I waited a few more seconds, then slowly turned the handle, opening the door just a crack. The hallway was indeed empty, but as I glanced down, my breath caught in my throat. There, on the dingy carpet, was a small, dark stain. As I watched, it grew larger, a drop of liquid falling from somewhere above to join it. With trembling fingers, I reached out and touched the stain. My fingertips came away red. Blood. I slammed the door shut, my heart racing. This couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't happen in real life, only in movies or crime novels. But the evidence was there on my fingers, undeniable and terrifying. I grabbed my phone again, dialing 911 with shaking hands. But before I could hit call, I heard it. Footsteps in the hallway, approaching my door. I froze, the phone still in my hand. The footsteps stopped right outside. Then, slowly, the handle began to turn. In a panic, I dropped the phone and lunged for the door, throwing the security chain on just as it started to open. The door hit the chain with a metallic clang, stopping only inches open. Through the gap, I could see a man's face, pale, with dark, wild eyes. Blood streaked one side of his face, dripping from his chin onto the carpet. "Let me in," he said, his voice low and raspy. "I need help." Every instinct screamed at me to keep the door closed, to call the police, to get as far away from this man as possible. But a small part of me wondered, what if he really was hurt? What if he was a victim, not a threat? "I'm calling an ambulance," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just stay there." His expression changed then, the pleading look replaced by something colder, harder. "No," he growled. "No police, no ambulance. Let me in now." He slammed his shoulder against the door, the chain rattling ominously. I backed away, grabbing my phone from where I'd dropped it. This time, I managed to dial 911. As I frantically explained the situation to the dispatcher, the man outside continued to throw himself against the door. The chain was starting to bend, the screws pulling loose from the worn wood. "Please hurry," I begged the dispatcher. "I don't think the door will hold much longer." Just as I said this, there was a final, powerful slam, and the chain gave way. The door flew open, revealing the man in all his terrifying glory. He was covered in blood, his clothes torn, a wild look in his eyes that spoke of desperation and danger. I scrambled backwards, looking for something, anything to use as a weapon. My hand closed around the bedside lamp, and I yanked it free, brandishing it in front of me like a club. "Stay back," I warned, my voice shaking. "The police are on their way." He laughed, a chilling sound devoid of any real humor. "They won't get here in time," he said, advancing slowly. "No one's coming to save you." I swung the lamp as he lunged forward, catching him on the side of the head. He staggered but didn't fall, instead grabbing the lamp and wrenching it from my grasp. It crashed to the floor, leaving us in semi-darkness, the only light now coming from the parking lot through the open door. I made a break for it, trying to dodge past him to the door, but he was too quick. His hand shot out, grabbing my arm with bruising force. I screamed, kicking and clawing, fighting with everything I had. We grappled, crashing into furniture, knocking over the small table, sending the TV to the floor with a crash of broken glass. I managed to break free for a moment, but as I turned to run, my foot caught on the fallen lamp cord. I went down hard, my head striking the corner of the bed frame. Stars exploded behind my eyes, pain lancing through my skull. I felt him grab me again, rolling me over. Through the haze of pain, I saw him raise something above his head, the broken neck of the lamp, jagged edge glinting in the dim light. This was it, I thought. This was how I was going to die. In a cheap motel room at the hands of a stranger, all because I'd been too tired to drive a few more miles to the next town. But just as the makeshift weapon began its downward arc, there was a new sound. Sirens, growing louder by the second. Blue and red lights flashed through the window, reflecting off the man's startled face. He hesitated, looking from me to the door and back again. Then, with a frustrated growl, he bolted, disappearing into the night. I lay there, stunned and aching, as police officers swarmed into the room. There were questions, paramedics, a blur of activity that I could barely comprehend. It wasn't until much later, sitting in a hospital bed with a mild concussion and various cuts and bruises, that I learned the full story. The man had killed someone in the room next door. A drug deal gone wrong, they said. He'd been trying to flee when he realized I might have heard something. The police caught him a few miles down the road, still covered in blood and carrying a bag full of drugs and cash. As I gave my statement to a kind-faced detective, I couldn't help but think about how close I'd come to being another victim. If I'd opened the door when he first knocked, if the police had arrived just a few seconds later. The detective assured me I'd done everything right, that my actions had probably saved my life. But as I lay in the hospital bed that night, unable to sleep, all I could think about was that first drop of blood on the carpet. How something so small could be the harbinger of such terror. I checked out of the hospital the next day, my road trip indefinitely postponed. As I took a taxi home, I found myself scrutinizing every person I saw, wondering what secrets they might be hiding, what darkness might lurk behind their eyes. The world felt different now, more dangerous. I knew the fear would fade with time, that eventually I'd be able to stay in a motel again without reliving that night. But I also knew I'd never again ignore my instincts, never brush off strange noises or uneasy feelings. Because sometimes, a drop of blood is just the beginning of the story, and it's up to us to decide whether we'll be the victims or the survivors. The moment I pushed open that cabin door, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. The air inside was thick with the stench of copper and rot, and in the dim light, I could see dark stains splattered across the walls, but it was too late to turn back now. The howling wind and the distant sound of pursuit told me I had no choice but to step inside and close the door behind me. It had started as a simple day hike. I'd been feeling cooped up, stressed from work and the general pressures of life. A solo trek through the woods seemed like the perfect way to clear my head and reconnect with nature. I'd done this trail before, or so I thought, but somewhere along the way, I must have taken a wrong turn. The first hint that something was off came when I noticed the sun starting to dip below the tree line. I checked my watch, startled to realize I'd been walking for hours longer than I'd intended. I pulled out my phone to check the GPS, but of course there was no signal. Typical. Okay, don't panic, I muttered to myself. Just retrace your steps. But as I turned to head back the way I came, I realized with a sinking feeling that I couldn't recognize any of my surroundings. The trees all looked the same. The path I thought I'd been following had disappeared, and the growing shadows made everything look alien and menacing. That's when I heard it. A long, low howl that echoed through the trees. Wolves. We had them in these woods, but they usually stayed far from the hiking trails. Another howl answered the first, closer this time. My heart began to race. I was lost in the woods, night was falling, and there were predators nearby. I picked a direction and started walking quickly, trying to keep my breathing steady and my panic at bay. The howls continued, seeming to come from all around me now. Were they getting closer, or was that just my imagination? Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, the sky opened up. Rain poured down in sheets, soaking me to the skin within minutes. The temperature dropped rapidly, and I could feel the cold seeping into my bones. Hypothermia was now a real concern. That's when I saw it, a faint light through the trees. Hope surged through me. Where there was light, there must be people, shelter, safety. I broke into a run, stumbling over roots and slipping on wet leaves. The light grew brighter, resolving into the shape of a small cabin. I could have cried with relief. As I burst into the small clearing where the cabin stood, I noticed a few odd details. The cabin looked old, really old, with a sagging roof and boards missing from the walls. There were no vehicles around, no signs of recent habitation. But there was a light on inside, faint and flickering. Maybe a caretaker, a fellow hiker who'd sought shelter. I pounded on the door, shouting for help. No response. The wolf howls were getting closer now, spurring me to desperation. I tried the handle and found it unlocked, and that's how I found myself stepping into a nightmare. The cabin was a single room, lit only by a guttering oil lamp on a rickety table. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I took in details that made my skin crawl. The stains on the wall weren't just water damage or mold. They were dark, rusty brown, unmistakably blood. Some of it looked fresh. The furniture was sparse. The table with the lamp, a couple of chairs, and a bed pushed against the far wall. But it was what was on the bed that made my breath catch in my throat. A body, or what was left of one. It was hard to tell in the low light, but it looked partially eaten. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the closed door. This couldn't be real. I had to be dreaming, hallucinating from hypothermia maybe, but the coppery smell of blood was too strong, too real. A low growl from outside snapped me back to my senses. The wolves were here. I was trapped between the predators outside and whatever horrors lurked in this cabin. Neither option seemed particularly appealing. As I stood there, paralyzed with indecision, my eye caught something on the table next to the lamp. It was a journal, open to a page covered in frantic, scrawling handwriting. Despite my better judgment, I found myself drawn to it. I picked it up with trembling hands and began to read. Day 37. The hunger is unbearable. I can feel myself changing. The others are gone now. I'm alone. But not for long. They're coming. They're always coming. The entry went on, becoming more disjointed and disturbing. It spoke of rituals, of sacrifices, of a hunger that could never be satisfied. The final line sent a chill down my spine. I am no longer the hunter. I am the bait. A crash from outside made me jump, the journal falling from my hands. Something was trying to get in. The door shuddered under the impact of a heavy body. The windows rattled. But it wasn't just wolves out there anymore. I could hear something else. Guttural noises that were almost, but not quite, human. I backed away from the door, looking around frantically for a weapon, an escape route, anything. That's when I noticed something I'd missed in my initial panic. A trapdoor in the floor, partially hidden under a threadbare rug. Another crash, louder this time. Wood splintered. They were breaking through. I dove for the trapdoor, yanking it open. A ladder descended into darkness. Without hesitation, I swung myself onto it and began to climb down, pulling the trapdoor shut above me. The space below was pitch black and smelled of damp earth. I fumbled in my pocket for my phone, using its faint light to illuminate my surroundings. I was in some kind of root cellar or tunnel. Rough-hewn walls stretched away into the darkness. Above me, I could hear the chaos as whatever was up there finally broke into the cabin. Inhuman screeches mixed with the snarls of wolves. The floor above me shook with the violence of their entry. I didn't wait around to see if they'd discover the trapdoor. I picked a direction and started moving, using my phone's light to guide me. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning. I lost all sense of direction, of time. My phone battery was dangerously low, and I dreaded the moment I'd be plunged into total darkness. Just as despair was starting to set in, I saw something ahead, a faint glimmer of light. I moved faster, hope giving me a burst of energy. The tunnel began to slope upward, and suddenly I was scrambling up an incline of loose dirt and rocks. I emerged into the pre-dawn light, gulping in the fresh air. I was on the side of a hill, the forest stretching out below me. In the distance, I could see the lights of a town. Civilization. Safety. As the sun began to rise, I made my way down the hill, my mind still reeling from what I'd experienced. Part of me wanted to convince myself it had all been some kind of stress-induced hallucination. But the dirt under my fingernails, the scratches on my arms, and the lingering smell of blood on my clothes told me it had been all too real. I never reported what I found in that cabin. Who would believe me? But I also never went hiking alone again. Some parts of the wilderness, I learned, are better left unexplored, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. As I reached the outskirts of town, I glanced back at the forest one last time. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing at the tree line, gaunt, feral, watching me with hungry eyes, but when I blinked, it was gone. I turned and walked into town, leaving the horrors of the night behind me. But deep down, I knew the memory of that cabin, and whatever inhabits those woods, would haunt me for the rest of my days. Some escapes, I realized, are only temporary. The first text message seemed innocent enough. "Nice book you're reading." I glanced up from my phone, scanning the coffee shop, but saw no one looking my way. It was probably just a wrong number, I thought. But as the messages kept coming, each one more personal than the last, I realized with growing horror that someone was watching my every move. It all started on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were my work-from-home days, and I always treated myself to an afternoon at my favorite local coffee shop. The routine was comforting. Same table by the window, same vanilla latte, same worn copy of whatever novel I was reading that week. I was deep into a particularly gripping chapter when my phone buzzed. The message popped up on my screen. "Nice book you're reading." I frowned, looking around the shop. It was fairly busy, the usual mix of students with laptops and professionals having meetings. No one seemed to be paying any attention to me. I shrugged it off and went back to my book. Probably just a friend who'd seen me through the window and decided to say hi. But when no one came in to join me, I started to feel a little uneasy. An hour later, As I was packing up to leave, another text came through. "Red really suits you." My hand froze halfway to my bag. I was wearing a red sweater. A chill ran down my spine as I once again scanned the coffee shop. Still no one looking my way. No one who seemed out of place. I hurried home, trying to shake off the creeping sense of unease. It was just a coincidence, I told myself. Maybe someone I knew had walked by outside and noticed me. But the messages didn't stop. They came at random intervals, always from an unknown number, always disturbingly accurate about what I was doing. "Dinner looks delicious," came a text as I was plating up my pasta that evening. "You should get some sleep," pinged my phone as I was getting ready for bed. "Nice pajamas," flashed across my screen as I climbed under the covers. By morning, I was a nervous wreck. I'd barely slept, jumping at every buzz of my phone. I called in sick to work, unable to face the thought of leaving my apartment. I spent the day going over every inch of my place, looking for hidden cameras or any sign of how someone could be watching me. I found nothing, which somehow made it worse. Was I going crazy? Imagining things? But then another text came. "Why aren't you at work? Are you feeling okay?" That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. With shaking hands, I called the police. The officer who came to take my statement was kind but skeptical. "It's probably just a prank," he said, flipping through the pages of texts I'd shown him. "Some kid who thinks they're being clever." "But how do they know what I'm doing?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "What I'm wearing, what I'm eating." He shrugged. "Social media, maybe. You'd be surprised how much information people put out there without realizing it." But I knew that wasn't it. I was careful with my online presence, never posted in real time, certainly never shared details about my daily routines. The officer left, promising to look into it but warning me not to expect much. "In the meantime," he said, "maybe change your number. See if that helps." I did change my number. I also deleted all my social media accounts, bought new curtains for every window, and installed a security system. But still, the texts came. "New phone. Who dis? Just kidding. I know it's you. Those new curtains don't really go with your decor, do they? That alarm system won't keep me out." I was losing my mind. I stopped going out except for absolute necessities. I barely slept, constantly checking and rechecking the locks, jumping at every sound. My friends started to worry, but I pushed them away. How could I explain what was happening without sounding completely insane? A week into this nightmare, I was sitting in my living room, blinds drawn, lights off, when a new message came through. "I see you, Sarah. I always see you." Something in me snapped. I'd had enough of being afraid, of feeling powerless. With a surge of reckless courage, I typed back, "Who are you? What do you want?" The response was almost immediate. "Come outside and find out." My heart pounded in my chest. This was it. A chance to confront my tormentor, to end this nightmare one way or another. I grabbed a kitchen knife, tucked it into my pocket, and headed for the door. The street was quiet, dimly lit by street lamps. At first, I didn't see anyone. Then, a figure stepped out of the shadows across the road. A man, average height and build, unremarkable except for the phone in his hand. "Hello, Sarah," he said, his voice sending chills down my spine. It was familiar somehow, though I couldn't place it. "Who are you?" I demanded, my hand closing around the knife in my pocket. "How are you doing this?" He smiled, and it was a cold, empty thing. "Don't you recognize me, Sarah? I'm hurt. After all, we used to be so close." And suddenly, it clicked. The voice, the way he stood, it all came rushing back. "Tim," I gasped. "But how? Why?" Tim had been my boyfriend in college, years ago. It had ended badly. He'd become possessive, controlling. I'd had to get a restraining order. "You think a piece of paper could keep me away?" he sneered. I never stopped watching you, Sarah. Never stopped loving you. This isn't love, I said, my voice shaking. This is sick. You need help, Tim. He took a step forward, and I tensed, ready to run or fight. But before he could get any closer, blue and red lights flooded the street. Police cars screeched to a halt, officers pouring out with guns drawn. "Step away from her," one shouted. "Hands where we can see them." Tim's face contorted with rage. He lunged towards me, but the officers were faster. In seconds, he was on the ground, handcuffed. As they led him away, one of the officers approached me. It was the same one who'd taken my statement earlier. "We've been monitoring your phone since you reported this," he explained. "When we saw that last exchange, we moved in. Are you okay?" I nodded numbly, the adrenaline starting to wear off, leaving me shaky and exhausted. The next few weeks were a blur of police statements and court appearances. It turned out Tim had been living in the apartment building across from mine, using high-powered cameras and hacked security systems to watch me. He'd been planning this for years, waiting for the right moment to make his move. As I sat in the courtroom, listening to the litany of charges against him, I felt a strange mix of relief and lingering fear. The nightmare was over, but the effects lingered. I still checked my phone obsessively, still startled at unexpected noises, but slowly, day by day, I started to reclaim my life. I went back to work, started seeing friends again. I even returned to my favorite coffee shop, though I chose a different table this time. As I sat there, sipping my latte and reading my book, my phone buzzed. For a moment, panic gripped me, but when I looked at the screen, it was just a message from a friend. "Hey, want to grab dinner later?" I smiled, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. I typed back a quick, "Sure," and put my phone away, turning my attention back to my book. The world felt a little safer, a little brighter. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like I was being watched. The moment the power went out, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't just the sudden darkness or the eerie silence that followed. It was the soft thud I heard from upstairs, where the children were supposed to be sleeping, that sent a chill down my spine. I had been babysitting for the Millers for about 6 months now. Every other Friday night, I'd come over to watch 8-year-old Lily and 6-year-old Max while their parents enjoyed a much-needed date night. It was an easy gig. The kids were well behaved, and the house was in a quiet, upscale neighborhood. Nothing ever happened here. Until tonight. The evening had started like any other. I arrived at 7 p.m., just as Mr. and Mrs. Miller were heading out the door. They gave me the usual instructions. Emergency numbers on the fridge, kids in bed by 9, help yourself to anything in the kitchen. Standard stuff. The kids and I had our usual routine. We played board games, watched a movie, and I made them mac and cheese for dinner. By 8:30, they were yawning, so I ushered them upstairs for bed a little early. They didn't even protest, which should have been my first clue that something was off. I had just settled onto the couch with a book when the storm started. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder rumbled in the distance. I've always loved storms, so I curled up, enjoying the atmosphere. Then at precisely 9:47 p.m., I remember checking my phone. Everything went dark. The sudden silence was jarring. No hum of the refrigerator, no whir of the air conditioning, just the sound of rain and my own breathing. I fumbled for my phone, using its light to navigate to the kitchen where I knew the Millers kept flashlights. That's when I heard it. A soft thud from upstairs, followed by what sounded like whispers. My heart started racing. "Lily, Max," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Everything okay up there?" No response. I told myself they were probably just scared of the dark, maybe trying to find their way to the bathroom. But as I climbed the stairs, flashlight in hand, a sense of dread grew in the pit of my stomach. The upstairs hallway was pitch black, my flashlight beam seeming feeble against the oppressive darkness. "Kids!" I called again, my voice sounding small and scared even to my own ears. I pushed open the door to Lily's room first. The beam of my flashlight swept across rumpled sheets and scattered stuffed animals. But no Lily. Trying to quell my rising panic, I moved to Max's room, empty as well. His race car bed neatly made as if it hadn't been slept in at all. A floorboard creaked behind me, and I whirled around, my heart in my throat. The beam of my flashlight caught a small figure at the end of the hall. For a split second, I felt relief. "Max, is that you, buddy?" But as the figure stepped forward, I realized it wasn't Max. It was too tall, too thin, and its eyes reflected the light like an animal's. I stumbled backward, my mouth open in a silent scream. The figure moved with unnatural speed, closing the distance between us in the blink of an eye. I caught a glimpse of long, claw-like fingers reaching for me before I slammed Max's door shut, fumbling with the lock. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone, dialing 911, but there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. Why would anything be easy tonight? A scratching sound came from the other side of the door, like nails or claws, dragging across the wood. "Hello, babysitter," a voice hissed, high and childlike but wrong somehow. "Won't you come out and play?" "Where are the children?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. "What have you done with them?" A giggle, far too adult for a child's voice. "The children are playing hide and seek. Don't you want to find them?" My mind raced. I needed to find Lily and Max, needed to get us all out of here. But how could I get past whatever was on the other side of that door? The scratching stopped, and for a moment, all was quiet. Then, from somewhere down the hall, I heard Lily's voice. "Help! Please, help me!" Every instinct screamed at me to stay put, that this was a trap. But I couldn't ignore a child in distress, even if it might not really be Lily. I had to know. Taking a deep breath, I eased the door open, peering out into the hallway. It was empty. No sign of the creature I'd seen before. I crept down the hall, following the sound of whimpering that might or might not have been Lily. It led me to the master bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was ajar. I pushed it open slowly, my flashlight beam darting around the room. "Lily, Max, are you in here?" A small shape huddled in the corner caught my eye. I moved closer, relief washing over me as I recognized Lily's pajamas. "Lily, thank God. Are you okay? Where's Max?" But as I reached out to touch her shoulder, she turned. The face that looked up at me wasn't Lily's. It was twisted, inhuman, with two sharp teeth and a too wide grin. I recoiled, a scream tearing from my throat. The thing that wasn't Lily lunged at me, its mouth opening impossibly wide. I swung the flashlight, connecting with its head with a sickening thud. It fell back, screeching. I ran, slamming the bedroom door behind me. I could hear it recovering, starting to pound on the door. I had to find Max and get out of here. "Max!" I shouted, no longer caring about stealth. "Max, where are you?" A muffled cry came from the linen closet. I yanked the door open, and there was Max, tears streaming down his face. "Oh, Sarah," he sobbed. "There's a monster. It took Lily." I scooped him up, my heart breaking. "I know, buddy. We're going to get out of here, okay? Hold on tight." The pounding from the master bedroom had stopped, which somehow was more terrifying than the noise. I took the stairs two at a time, Max clinging to me like a lifeline. We were halfway to the front door when the lights suddenly came back on, momentarily blinding me. I blinked, trying to adjust to the sudden brightness. And there, standing between us and the door, was Lily. The real Lily, looking confused and scared. "Sarah, what's going on? Why are you carrying Max?" I stared at her, my mind reeling. Lily, but upstairs, there was... A car pulled into the driveway. The Millers were home. As if in a daze, I walked to the door and opened it. Mr. and Mrs. Miller took in the scene. Me, wild-eyed and disheveled, holding a crying Max with a bewildered Lily standing nearby. "Sarah?" Mrs. Miller asked cautiously. "Is everything all right?" I opened my mouth, then closed it again. How could I explain what had happened? Would they even believe me? In the end, I mumbled something about the power outage scaring the kids. The Millers seemed skeptical but didn't push it. They thanked me, paid me, and saw me out. As I drove home, my hands still shaking on the steering wheel, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Had it all been a hallucination, some kind of waking nightmare brought on by the storm and the power outage? But I could still feel the weight of the flashlight as it connected with that thing's head. Could still hear its inhuman screeching. Could still see those glowing eyes in the darkness. I never babysat for the Millers again. In fact, I never babysat again, period. Some experiences change you forever, make you question everything you thought you knew about the world. And some things once seen can never be unseen. Even now, years later, I still check the dark corners of rooms, still flinch at unexplained noises in the night. Because I know the truth now. Monsters are real, and sometimes they wear the faces of those we're meant to protect. The security camera flickered to life, revealing an empty hallway. Then, for just a split second, a shadow darted across the screen. My heart leapt into my throat as I leaned closer to the monitor. I was supposed to be alone in this building, but clearly, terrifyingly, I wasn't. I hadn't wanted to work the night shift at Grayson Co. law firm, but as the newest paralegal, I didn't have much choice when Mr. Grayson himself asked me to stay late and organize the files for a big case. "It'll be quiet," he'd said. "You'll get more done without the usual office hubbub." If only he knew how wrong he'd be. The evening started normally enough. I ordered takeout, cranked up my playlist, and dove into the mountain of paperwork. The hours ticked by, and slowly but surely, the chaos of legal documents began to resemble something orderly. It was nearing midnight when I first noticed something odd. A faint sound like footsteps echoing from somewhere in the building. I paused my music and listened intently, but the noise had stopped. Shrugging it off as the building settling, I returned to my work, but the sounds continued. A door closing softly in the distance, the whisper of fabric against a wall. Each time I'd stop and listen, only for the noise to disappear as quickly as it came. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself. "You're letting your imagination run wild." Still, a nagging sense of unease had taken root. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more frequently, starting at every creak and groan of the old building. That's when I remembered the security cameras. Mr. Grayson had shown me how to access the feeds during my orientation, just in case. At the time, I thought it was overkill. Now, I was grateful for his paranoia. I pulled up the camera feeds on my computer, cycling through views of empty hallways and darkened offices. Everything looked normal, peaceful even. I was about to close the window, feeling a bit foolish, when movement caught my eye. There, on the feed from the third-floor hallway, a shadow flitted across the screen. It was there, and gone so fast I almost thought I'd imagined it. Almost. My hand shook as I rewound the footage. There it was again, a dark shape, moving with unnatural speed. Not a trick of the light, not my imagination. Someone, or something, was in the building with me. Panic rose in my throat as I frantically checked the other cameras. Most showed nothing but empty rooms. But then, on the second-floor feed, another shadow. This one lingered longer. A vaguely human shape standing at the end of the hallway. As I watched, it turned slowly, as if looking directly at the camera. Directly at me. I slammed the laptop shut, my heart pounding. What should I do? Call the police, but what would I tell them? That I saw a shadow. They'd think I was crazy or pulling a prank. No, I needed to be sure. I needed to see for myself what was going on. It was stupid, the kind of decision that gets people killed in horror movies. But I couldn't just sit there waiting for whatever it was to find me. I grabbed my phone and the heaviest stapler I could find, a poor weapon, but better than nothing. and crept out of the office. The hallway was dark, lit only by the dim glow of emergency exit signs. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified in the silence. I made my way to the stairwell, intending to check the second floor where I'd last seen the figure. But as I reached for the door handle, I heard it. Footsteps coming up the stairs from below. Slow, deliberate steps, getting closer with each passing second. I backed away from the door, looking frantically for a place to hide. There was a supply closet a few feet away. I ducked inside, pulling the door closed just as the stairwell door opened. Through the slats in the closet door, I could see a figure step into the hallway. It was tall, taller than any person I'd ever seen, and thin to the point of being skeletal. It moved with an unnatural grace, its head swiveling as if scanning the hallway. I held my breath, pressing myself against the back wall of the closet. The figure paused, its head tilting to one side as if listening. Then, slowly, it began to turn towards my hiding spot. In that moment, my phone chose to vibrate. I'd forgotten to silence it, and now it was buzzing loudly in my pocket, signaling a text message. The figure's head snapped towards the closet. It moved with blinding speed, crossing the distance in the blink of an eye. A hand, pale and elongated, reached for the door handle. I did the only thing I could think of. I burst out of the closet, swinging the stapler with all my might. It connected with a sickening thud, and the figure stumbled back. Without looking to see if I'd done any real damage, I ran. I sprinted down the hallway, my footsteps echoing loudly in the empty building. Behind me, I could hear it recovering, its own steps quickening as it gave chase. I reached the elevators, jabbing the down button repeatedly as if that would make it arrive faster. The sound of pursuit grew closer. In desperation, I turned to the emergency stairwell instead. I took the stairs two at a time, nearly falling in my haste. I could hear it above me, its inhuman speed allowing it to gain ground quickly. As I burst out onto the ground floor, I risked a glance back. It was at the top of the stairs, its form silhouetted against the emergency lights. For a moment, our eyes met, and I saw nothing human in its gaze. I ran for the main doors, fumbling with my key card. The reader beeped, the lock disengaged, and I was out, the cool night air hitting me like a slap to the face. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I peeled out of the parking lot, I looked in my rearview mirror. There, standing in front of the building, was the figure. It raised one long, spindly arm as if in farewell. I drove aimlessly for hours, too afraid to go home, too wired to stop. When the sun finally rose, I found myself parked outside a small diner. Exhausted and still trembling, I went inside and ordered a coffee. As I sat there, trying to make sense of what had happened, my phone buzzed. It was Mr. Grayson. "Hope the late night wasn't too boring," his text read. "Did you get the files organized?" I stared at the message, a hysterical laugh bubbling up in my throat. How could I possibly explain what had happened? Who would believe me? In the end, I simply replied, "All done. Won't be able to come in today. Not feeling well." It wasn't a lie. I felt sick to my stomach, my reality shaken to its core. I knew I could never go back to that office, never work another late night anywhere, because now I knew the truth. When the sun goes down and the buildings empty out, we're not as alone as we think we are, and sometimes, the things that lurk in the shadows are all too real. The moment he offered to help, I should have driven away. But desperation makes fools of us all, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, turning the lonely stretch of road into a corridor of shadows, I became the biggest fool of all. It had been a long day of driving. My wife, Sarah, and I were on our way to her parents' own house for Thanksgiving, a 6-hour journey that had stretched into 8 thanks to holiday traffic and an unexpected detour. We were tired, cranky, and more than ready to reach our destination. That's when our old sedan, which had been making worrying noises for the last hour, finally gave up the ghost. A loud pop, a plume of smoke from under the hood, and we were coasting to a stop on the shoulder of a road that seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions. "Perfect," Sarah muttered, her frustration palpable. "Just perfect." I tried to stay positive as I got out to check the engine, but one look told me this was beyond my meager car knowledge. Steam hissed from somewhere deep in the tangle of pipes and wires, and there was a smell of burning rubber that made my stomach churn. "Can you fix it?" Sarah called from inside the car. I shook my head, closing the hood. "No chance. We're gonna need a tow." That's when we discovered our next problem: no cell service. We were truly in the middle of nowhere, with no way to call for help. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, fear creeping into her voice. I looked up and down the empty road. The sun was setting fast, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples. It would be dark soon, and the thought of being stranded here all night sent a shiver down my spine. "I guess I'll have to walk and try to find help," I said, not relishing the idea. "There has to be a gas station or a house somewhere nearby." Sarah grabbed my arm. "You can't leave me here alone." I was about to respond when headlights appeared in the distance, growing brighter as they approached. Hope surged through me. Maybe our luck was changing. The vehicle, an old pickup truck, slowed as it neared us. The driver, a man who looked to be in his 50s with a weathered face and a trucker cap, leaned out the window. "You folks having some trouble?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. I explained our situation, relief washing over me at the prospect of help. The man nodded, scratching his stubbled chin. "Well, ain't that a pickle? Tell you what, I know a bit about engines. Why don't I take a look?" I hesitated for a moment. There was something off about the man, a glint in his eye that made me uneasy. But what choice did we have? "That'd be great, thanks," I said, forcing a smile. The man parked his truck and ambled over to our car. He peered under the hood, humming and hawing, while I stood by anxiously. "Yep, looks like your radiator's shot," he finally declared. "You ain't going nowhere in this thing tonight." My heart sank. Is there a town nearby? Somewhere we could get a tow? The man shook his head. "Nearest town's about 30 miles that way," he said, pointing down the road. "But I'll tell you what. My place ain't far from here. Why don't I give you folks a ride? You can use my phone, maybe call for a tow in the morning." Every instinct I had was screaming at me to decline, to take our chances on the road. But the sun had almost disappeared now, and the thought of spending the night in our broken-down car was less than appealing. I glanced at Sarah, who looked as uncertain as I felt. But she gave a small nod, and I turned back to the man. "That's very kind of you," I said. "We really appreciate it." The man's face split into a wide grin, revealing teeth that were just a bit too sharp. "Well, all right then. Let's get going before it gets too dark to see." We quickly grabbed our overnight bags from the trunk and climbed into the man's truck. The interior smelled of stale cigarettes and something else I couldn't quite place. Something metallic and unpleasant. As we pulled away, leaving our car behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd made a terrible mistake. The man introduced himself as Earl and attempted some small talk, but there was an underlying tension that made conversation difficult. Sarah sat pressed against me, her hand gripping mine tightly. We drove for what felt like hours, the road becoming increasingly narrow and winding. The trees pressed in on both sides, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers in the truck's headlights. How much further did you say it was?" I asked, trying to keep the nervousness out of my voice. Earl chuckled, a sound that sent chills down my spine. "Not much further now, just around the bend." But as we rounded the bend, there was no house in sight, just more dark road stretching ahead. "I think we've gone far enough," I said firmly. "You can let us out here. We'll walk back to our car." Earl's demeanor changed instantly. The friendly facade dropped away, replaced by something cold and predatory. "Oh, I don't think so," he growled. "You're coming home with me. whether you like it or not." He reached across me, faster than I would have thought possible for a man his age, and locked the doors. Sarah screamed as he suddenly accelerated, the truck lurching forward with alarming speed. I grabbed for the steering wheel, trying to force us off the road, but Earl was surprisingly strong. He shoved me back, his eyes never leaving the road. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he snarled. "I wouldn't want to crash and hurt your pretty little wife, now would we?" Sarah was sobbing now, her nails digging into my arm. I felt helpless, my mind racing to find a way out of this nightmare. Suddenly, Earl slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded to a stop in front of a dilapidated house that seemed to appear out of nowhere. It was a monster of a building, all peeling paint and boarded-up windows. "Home sweet home," Earl cackled. "Now, let's not have any trouble. You two are going to come inside nice and quiet-like." He pulled out a wicked-looking knife, the blade glinting in the moonlight. "Move," he ordered. With no other choice, we got out of the truck. Earl herded us towards the house, the knife pressed against my back. As we approached the front door, I could hear strange noises coming from inside, scratching, whimpering, and something that sounded horribly like human moans. Earl pushed open the door, revealing a dimly lit interior that smelled of decay and something far worse. "Welcome to your new home," he sneered. "Hope you like it here, 'cause you ain't never leaving." In that moment, something in me snapped. I couldn't let this happen. Couldn't let Sarah suffer whatever horrors this madman had planned. With a yell, I spun around, knocking the knife from Earl's hand. He roared in anger, lunging for me, but I was faster. I grabbed a nearby lamp and swung it with all my might. It connected with Earl's head with a sickening crack, and he went down hard. "Run!" I shouted to Sarah, grabbing her hand. We bolted out the door and into the night, not daring to look back. We ran until our lungs burned, the sound of our pounding footsteps the only thing breaking the eerie silence of the woods. Finally, we stumbled onto a main road, where a passing trucker took pity on us and gave us a ride to the nearest town. The police were skeptical of our story at first, but when they investigated Earl's property, they found evidence of multiple disappearances over the years. Earl himself was nowhere to be found, having apparently fled into the night. In the days and weeks that followed, Sarah and I struggled to come to terms with what had happened. The fear lingered, making us jump at shadows and eye strangers with suspicion, but we had survived, and that counted for something. We never did make it to her parents' house that Thanksgiving, but as we sat in our apartment, eating takeout turkey and holding each other close, we realized we had so much to be thankful for. The road trip that nearly ended in tragedy had taught us a valuable lesson. Sometimes, the real monsters aren't the ones in stories or movies. Sometimes, they're the friendly stranger offering help on a dark, lonely road. And sometimes, the difference between life and death is a split-second decision to trust your instincts and fight back. The first time I noticed my coffee mug had moved, I brushed it off as forgetfulness. By the third time, I knew someone, or something, had been in my apartment. And as I stared at the footage from the hidden camera I'd installed, my blood ran cold. I wasn't just being paranoid. I wasn't alone. It all started about a month after I moved into my new apartment. I'd finally escaped my noisy roommates and found a place of my own. A cozy one-bedroom in a quiet part of town. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, and I reveled in the peace and privacy. At first, everything was perfect. I settled into a routine, enjoying the simple pleasure of knowing exactly where I'd left things and finding them in the same spot when I returned. No more missing socks or mysteriously emptied milk cartons. But then, little things started to feel off. I'd come home from work to find a window slightly ajar that I was certain I'd closed. My favorite sweater, which I always hung in the closet, would be folded on my bed. The TV remote would be on the coffee table instead of the arm of the couch where I habitually left it. Each incident was small, easily explained away. Maybe I'd forgotten to close the window properly. Perhaps I'd absent-mindedly folded the sweater in a half-awake state. The remote could have fallen off the couch arm. I told myself I was being silly, that living alone was making me paranoid. But the niggling feeling of wrongness persisted, growing stronger with each passing day. The breaking point came when I woke up one morning to find my laptop open on the kitchen table. I never used my laptop in the kitchen, and I distinctly remembered shutting it down and putting it away in my desk drawer the night before. Heart pounding. I checked my browser history. There were searches I didn't recognize, for things I'd never look up. How to pick locks. Best ways to stay hidden in plain sight. Undetectable poisons. That's when I knew. Someone had been in my apartment. Someone had used my laptop. Someone had been invading my privacy in the most intimate way possible. I called in sick to work that day, my mind racing with possibilities. Was it my landlord? A maintenance worker with a spare key? Or something far more sinister? I didn't want to call the police. What could I tell them? That someone had moved my coffee mug and used my laptop. They'd think I was crazy. No, I needed proof. So I went out and bought a small, inconspicuous camera. I set it up in my living room, angled to capture most of the apartment. Then I waited. For 3 days, nothing happened. The footage showed only me, going about my daily routine. I started to think maybe I had imagined it all, that stress or lack of sleep had made me paranoid. But on the 4th night, everything changed. I was at a late meeting at work. The camera footage started normally, showing my empty apartment as the sun set and darkness fell. Then, at 9:47 p.m., something moved in the shadows. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, but then a figure stepped into view. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed all in black. He moved with an eerie grace, like he knew exactly where to step to avoid making noise. My heart raced as I watched him methodically go through my things. He checked drawers, rifled through papers, even looked under my mattress. But he didn't take anything. Instead, he seemed to be rearranging things, moving items just slightly out of place. After about an hour, he went to my laptop. I watched in horror as he opened it, typed for a while, then carefully placed it back exactly as he'd found it. Just before he left, he did something that made my blood run cold. He looked directly at the camera and smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile, it was predatory, knowing. He'd been aware of the camera the whole time. I felt sick. This wasn't some random break-in. This person had been toying with me, deliberately moving things to make me doubt myself. And now he knew I knew. I didn't go home that night. I couldn't bear the thought of being in that space, knowing he'd been there. Instead, I went to a friend's house, the footage from my camera playing on a loop in my mind. The next day, I went to the police. They took my statement and looked at the footage, their faces grave. They promised to investigate, to increase patrols in my area, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. One break-in didn't mean I had a stalker, they said. It could have been a one-time thing, but I knew better. This had been going on for weeks, maybe longer. And now that he knew I was onto him, I feared what he might do next. I stayed with my friend for a few days, jumping at every sound, scrutinizing every stranger on the street. Was that him? Did he follow me here? The paranoia was overwhelming. When I finally worked up the courage to return to my apartment, I found it exactly as I'd left it. No sign of disturbance, no moved objects. For a moment, I felt a flicker of relief. Maybe it was over. Then I saw it. A note on my kitchen table, written in handwriting I didn't recognize. "I'll be seeing you," it said. Nothing more. I fled the apartment, my hands shaking so badly I could barely lock the door. I ran to my car, threw my hastily packed bag in the back, and drove. I didn't have a destination in mind. I just knew I needed to get away. As I drove through the night, my mind raced with questions. Who was he? What did he want? How long had this been going on? The not knowing was almost worse than the invasion itself. I ended up at a motel several towns over. As I lay in the lumpy bed staring at the water-stained ceiling, I tried to make sense of it all. How had my life come to this? Running from my own home, terrified of shadows and moved objects. Sleep eluded me. Every creak of the old motel made me flinch. Every passing car could be him, tracking me down. I felt like I was losing my mind. The next morning, bleary-eyed and exhausted, I made a decision. I couldn't live like this. I couldn't let this person, whoever he was, control my life through fear. I drove back to my apartment, my resolve strengthening with each mile. I wasn't going to be a victim anymore. I was going to take back control. When I got home, I did a thorough search of every inch of my apartment. I looked for hidden cameras, for signs of how he might be getting in. I changed the locks, installed a security system, and bought more cameras to cover every possible angle. Then I sat down and wrote a note of my own. "I know you're watching," I wrote, "but so am I. This ends now." I left it on the kitchen table, right where he'd left his. That night, I didn't hide. I didn't run. I sat in my living room, lights on, waiting. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. Still, I waited. At 3:17 a.m., I heard it. The soft click of a lock being picked, the whisper of the door opening. Footsteps, so quiet I could barely hear them. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to remain still. I watched as the handle of my living room door slowly turned. The door opened, and there he was. Tall, thin, dressed in black, just like in the camera footage. He froze when he saw me sitting there, his eyes widening in surprise. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. Then, slowly, deliberately, I reached for my phone. "I'm calling the police," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "It's over." He looked at me, then at the phone, then back at me. Something shifted in his expression. Was it respect? Disappointment? I couldn't tell. Without a word, he turned and walked out. I heard the front door open and close. By the time the police arrived, he was long gone. They never caught him. Despite the evidence, despite my testimony, he seemed to vanish into thin air. The investigation eventually went cold, but he never came back. Whatever game he'd been playing, whatever twisted pleasure he'd gotten from invading my space and messing with my mind, it was over. It took time, but slowly, I reclaimed my home and my peace of mind. I kept the cameras, kept the security system, but I also kept living, refusing to let fear rule my life. Sometimes, late at night, I still find myself checking the locks, scanning the room for things out of place. But then I remind myself, I'm not a victim, I'm a survivor, and this is my home. No one, not even a shadow in the night, can take that from me. The headlights in my rearview mirror had been there for the last hour, never falling behind, never pulling ahead. As I took another random turn down an unfamiliar road, my heart sank. The car behind me turned too. This wasn't a coincidence anymore. I was being followed. It had started as a normal evening drive. I was heading home after visiting my sister in the next state over, a trip I'd made dozens of times before. The sun had set about an hour into my journey, and I was settling in for the long haul, my playlist humming through the speakers and a thermos of coffee within easy reach. I first noticed the car about 2 hours in, a dark sedan, nondescript enough that I couldn't even tell the make or model in the darkness. It caught my attention because it had been behind me for a while, maintaining the same distance no matter how my speed fluctuated. At first, I brushed it off. We were on the highway after all. Plenty of people were making long trips, and it wasn't unusual for cars to stay together for extended stretches. But as the miles ticked by and the car remained constant in my mirrors, a knot of unease began to form in my stomach. I decided to test my growing suspicion. I switched lanes unnecessarily, slowed down, sped up. Each time, the car mirrored my actions. The knot in my stomach tightened. Trying to stay calm, I ran through possible explanations in my mind. Maybe they were headed to the same area as me. Maybe it was just a very cautious driver using me as a pace car. Maybe I was being paranoid. But then I took an exit I didn't need, one that led away from my route home. The car followed. My heart began to race. This was really happening. Someone was following me, and I had no idea why. I grabbed my phone, intending to call 911, only to find I had no signal. Of course, I was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by fields and patches of forest miles from the nearest town. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced myself to think. What were my options? I couldn't outrun them. My old sedan was no match for whatever they were driving. I couldn't call for help. The only choice was to try to lose them. I began taking random turns, down smaller and smaller roads, left, right again. Gravel crunched under my tires as the paved roads gave way to dirt tracks. Still, the headlights followed. The landscape became increasingly rural. Farmhouses, barns, and silos loomed out of the darkness, widely spaced and often dilapidated. There were no lights on in any of them, no signs of life, no one to help me. I was completely lost now, with no idea how to get back to the main road. My gas gauge was dipping dangerously low. I was going to have to confront this situation soon, whether I wanted to or not. That's when I saw it. A narrow side road, almost hidden by overgrown bushes. Without thinking, I yanked the wheel, taking the turn so sharply my tires squealed in protest. I killed my headlights, plunging myself into darkness and gunned the engine. The road was rough, pitted with potholes that jarred my teeth. Branches scraped against the sides of my car, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't. This was my only chance. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a minute or two, I saw a gap in the trees to my left. An old barn, its paint peeling and roof partially caved in. I made another sharp turn, pulling behind the barn and cutting the engine. I sat there in the darkness, my breathing loud in the sudden silence. Had it worked? Had I lost them? Long seconds ticked by. I strained my ears, listening for the sound of an approaching engine. Nothing. Just the rustle of leaves in the breeze and the pounding of my own heart. Slowly, cautiously, I peered around the edge of the barn. The road was empty. No headlights, no engine noise. I'd done it. I'd actually lost them. Relief washed over me, so powerful it left me lightheaded. I slumped back in my seat, letting out a shaky laugh. It was over. I was safe. That's when I heard it. A car door closing, somewhere close by. Too close. Ice flooded my veins. They hadn't been fooled by my maneuver. They'd followed me, silent and lights off. And now they were here. They had me cornered. I looked around frantically for a weapon, anything I could use to defend myself. My hand closed around the thermos in the cup holder. It wasn't much, but it was heavy and full of hot coffee. It would have to do. A beam of light swept across the barn, and I ducked down in my seat. Footsteps crunched on gravel, getting closer. A shadow fell across my car window. Time seemed to slow down. I saw a hand reach for the door handle. In that moment, I made a split-second decision. I wasn't going to sit there and wait to be attacked. I was going to fight. As the door began to open, I exploded into action. I flung the door open with all my strength, catching my pursuer off guard. They stumbled back, and I lunged out of the car, thermos raised like a club. But as I swung, the beam of their flashlight hit my face, momentarily blinding me. My wild swing went wide, and I lost my balance, stumbling forward. Strong hands grabbed my arms, steadying me. "Whoa, easy there," a voice said. A familiar voice. I blinked, spots dancing in my vision. As my eyes adjusted, I found myself staring at a uniform, a police uniform. "Officer Davis?" I said incredulously, recognizing the cop from my sister's small town. He nodded, looking equally confused. "Mrs. Johnson, what are you doing out here?" The adrenaline drained out of me so fast I felt my knees go weak. I thought you were following me, trying to hurt me. Understanding dawned on his face. Oh, geez, I'm so sorry. I recognized your car leaving town, and I noticed your taillight was out. I was trying to pull you over to let you know, but you kept taking all these turns. I thought maybe you were drunk or something was wrong. I let out a laugh that was half sob. All that fear, all that panic over a burnout taillight. Officer Davis helped me sit down, calling in our location on his radio. As we waited for a tow truck to come get my now empty car, he explained that he'd lost sight of me when I'd made that sharp turn, but had seen the disturbed bushes and guessed where I'd gone. I'm sorry I scared you so badly, he said, handing me a bottle of water from his cruiser. I should have called for backup and used the siren. I just didn't think. I shook my head, taking a shaky sip of water. It's not your fault. I let my imagination run wild. I should have just pulled over in the first place. We sat in silence for a while, the adrenaline slowly fading from my system. Finally, I spoke up. Can I ask you something, Officer Davis? Of course. If it had been someone trying to hurt me, did I do the right things? Trying to lose them, I mean. He thought for a moment. What you did good staying on roads where other people might see you, and finding a place to hide was smart. But the best thing to do is always try to get to a populated area, a police station, a busy store, somewhere with lots of people. I nodded, filing away this information and hoping I'd never need to use it. The tow truck arrived, and Officer Davis insisted on following me all the way home, this time with his lights on so I could see him clearly. As I finally pulled into my driveway, the first light of dawn was breaking on the horizon. I waved goodbye to Officer Davis, feeling exhausted but profoundly grateful. As I unlocked my front door, I made a mental note to get my taillight fixed first thing in the morning. And maybe, I thought with a wry smile, to ease up on the late-night crime podcasts. That night had taught me an important lesson. The world could indeed be a dangerous place, but sometimes, the monsters we imagine are chasing us are just concerned citizens trying to help. The trick is knowing the difference and being prepared either way. The library had always been my sanctuary, a place of quiet comfort and endless adventures through books. But as the lights flickered and died, plunging me into darkness, I realized it had become my prison. The whispers echoing through the stacks told me I wasn't alone, and whatever was in here with me was anything but comforting. It was a Friday night, and I was burning the midnight oil at the university library. As a graduate student, knee-deep in my thesis, late nights surrounded by towering bookshelves had become my new normal. I'd grown to love the hushed atmosphere, the smell of old paper, and the soft glow of the reading lamps. It was peaceful, predictable, until it wasn't. I'd been so engrossed in my research that I hadn't noticed the hours slipping by. The library had officially closed at 10 p.m., but as a grad student, I had after-hours access. I often found myself alone in the vast building, which had never bothered me before. If anything, I relished the solitude. It was nearing 1 a.m. when I first noticed something was off. A chill ran down my spine, the kind you get when you suddenly feel like you're being watched. I looked up from my books, scanning the dimly lit area around me. Nothing seemed out of place, but the feeling persisted. I shook it off, chiding myself for being paranoid. Too many late nights and too much caffeine, I reasoned. But as I tried to refocus on my work, I couldn't shake the nagging sense of unease. That's when the lights began to flicker. At first, it was subtle, just a slight dimming that I might not have noticed if I hadn't already been on edge. But then, it became more pronounced, the overhead fluorescence pulsing like an erratic heartbeat. I sat up straight, suddenly alert. This wasn't normal. The library's electrical system was old, sure, but I'd never seen anything like this. As if responding to my thoughts, the lights gave one final violent flicker and went out completely. I was plunged into darkness so absolute it took my breath away. For a moment, I sat frozen, my eyes straining against the blackness. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own rapid breathing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and scared in the vast space. "Is anyone there? Security?" No response, just more silence. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking slightly. The screen's glow was painfully bright in the darkness, making me squint. No service. Of course. Using my phone's flashlight, I gathered my things, deciding it was definitely time to leave. As I stood, the beam of light caught something that made my blood run cold. Footprints in the dust on the floor, leading away from my table and disappearing into the stacks. Footprints that hadn't been there earlier. My heart began to race. I wasn't alone. "Who's there?" I called again, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "This isn't funny. Show yourself." That's when I heard it. A whisper, so faint I almost thought I'd imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time. "Join us," it said, the words seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my chair. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a prank. Some stupid kids who'd snuck in and were trying to scare me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The voice I'd heard wasn't human. It was old, ancient even, and filled with a hunger that made my skin crawl. I ran. My footsteps echoed loudly as I sprinted through the stacks, my phone's light bouncing wildly ahead of me. I headed for the main staircase, desperate to reach the ground floor and the exit. But as I rounded a corner, I skidded to a halt. The staircase was gone. Where it should have been was just more bookshelves, stretching endlessly into the darkness. "This is impossible," I muttered, backing away. I turned, intending to find another way out, only to find that the path I'd just come from had changed as well. Nothing looked familiar anymore. The whispers started up again, louder now and coming from all directions. "Join us," they said. "Stay with us forever." I spun around, trying to locate the source of the voices, but they seemed to be coming from the books themselves. As I watched in horror, a thick, inky darkness began to seep from between the pages, oozing down the shelves like tar. I ran again, no longer caring about finding an exit, just desperate to get away from those voices and that creeping darkness. I took random turns, my lungs burning as I sprinted down aisle after aisle. Suddenly, my foot caught on something, sending me sprawling. My phone flew from my hand, skittering across the floor and under a bookshelf. Its light flickered and went out, leaving me in total darkness once more. I lay there for a moment, the cold floor pressed against my cheek, trying to catch my breath. The whispers were all around me now, a constant susurration that made it hard to think. "This isn't real," I said to myself, squeezing my eyes shut. "This can't be real." But when I opened my eyes, I saw them, shapes moving in the darkness, vaguely human but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, with too many angles. They were getting closer. I scrambled to my feet, backing away until I hit a wall. The shapes advanced, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. "Join us," they said. "Become one with the knowledge. Stay in the library forever." I felt something cold and sticky touch my arm. Looking down, I saw tendrils of that inky darkness wrapping around my wrist, trying to pull me in. "No!" I shouted, yanking my arm free. "I don't want to stay. I want to leave." As if triggered by my words, a warm light suddenly appeared to my left. It was faint, but in the oppressive darkness, it shone like a beacon. Without hesitation, I ran towards it. The whispers rose to a fever pitch, the shadows lunging for me, but I was faster. I burst through the light and found myself standing in front of the library, the early morning sun warm on my face. I spun around, but behind me was just the normal library entrance, closed and locked for the night. No darkness, no whispers, no strange shapes, just an ordinary building in the light of day. My legs gave out, and I sank to the ground, my whole body shaking. Had it all been a dream, some sort of stress-induced hallucination? But then I saw it. On my wrist, where the inky tendril had grabbed me, was a mark. It looked like a smudge of black ink, but no matter how hard I rubbed, it wouldn't come off. I never went back to that library. I finished my thesis using online resources and other facilities. My professors were confused by my sudden aversion to the place, but I couldn't bring myself to explain. Who would believe me? Sometimes, late at night, I still hear those whispers. They come from the shadows in the corners of my room, from the spaces between books on my shelves. They call to me, inviting me back to the library, promising knowledge beyond my wildest dreams if I'll just join them. But I know better now. I know that some kinds of knowledge come at too high a price, and I know that libraries, for all their wonder and magic, can hold secrets darker than we can imagine. So I keep my lights on at night, and I'm careful about where I read, because once you've heard the whispers in the stacks, you never forget them, and they never forget you. The first thing I noticed was the silence. In the woods, there's always some noise. Birds chirping, leaves rustling, small animals scurrying about. But as I approached the abandoned campsite, the forest went eerily quiet. That's when I knew something was terribly wrong. I'd been hiking for about 3 hours, enjoying the solitude and the crisp autumn air. The trail was a familiar one, winding through dense forest and offering breathtaking views of the valley below. I'd done this hike dozens of times before, but today felt different somehow. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of foreboding I couldn't shake. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw it. A clearing up ahead, unnatural in its suddenness. As I got closer, I realized it was a campsite, but not just any campsite. This one looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. A tent stood half collapsed, its fabric torn and flapping in the breeze. Camping gear was strewn about haphazardly. A backpack here, a sleeping bag there. A small fire pit still smoldered, wisps of smoke curling up into the air. My first thought was that maybe some inexperienced campers had gotten spooked by wildlife and taken off. It wouldn't be the first time a bear sighting had sent city folks running. But as I surveyed the scene, that explanation felt increasingly unlikely. There were signs of a struggle, deep gouges in the earth, like something, or someone, had been dragged. A hiking boot lay on its side, the laces tangled and caked with mud. And there, just at the edge of the clearing, a dark stain on a rock that looked horribly like blood. My heart began to race. This was bad, really bad. I pulled out my phone, intending to call for help. But of course there was no signal. I was miles from the nearest town, completely cut off. I debated what to do. The smart thing would be to turn around, hike back to my car, and alert the authorities. But what if someone was hurt? What if they needed help right now? Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate further. I approached the tent cautiously, calling out as I went. "Hello? Is anyone here? Do you need help?" No response, just that eerie silence. I reached the tent and peered inside. It was empty, but signs of a hasty departure were everywhere. A book lay open, its pages fluttering in the breeze. A half-eaten energy bar sat atop a crumpled map. And there, caught on a zipper, was a scrap of fabric. I leaned closer, and my blood ran cold. It wasn't fabric. It was hair. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. This was no animal attack. Whatever had happened here was far worse. That's when I heard it. A rustle in the underbrush, too deliberate to be the wind. I spun around, my eyes scanning the tree line. For a moment, I saw nothing, then saw a flash of movement, something ducking behind a tree. "Who's there?" I called, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. "Show yourself." Silence. Then another rustle, closer this time. I backed away slowly, my eyes never leaving the spot where I'd seen the movement. My foot hit something soft. I glanced down and immediately wished I hadn't. It was a backpack, and protruding from it was a hand, a human hand, pale and lifeless. Panic surged through me. I turned to run, but my foot caught on a root and I went down hard. As I scrambled to get up, I heard it. Footsteps, heavy and purposeful, coming straight for me. I looked up, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. And there it was, emerging from the trees. A figure, tall and broad, its face hidden by a crude mask made of what looked like animal skin. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure raised something, an axe, I realized with horror, and charged. Adrenaline took over. I rolled to the side just as the axe came down, biting deep into the earth where I'd been a split second before. I scrambled to my feet and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for the trail or direction. All that mattered was getting away. I could hear it behind me. Giving chase, the sound of its heavy breathing and the thud of its footsteps spurred me on, even as branches whipped at my face and thorns tore at my clothes. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. But still it followed, tireless and relentless. I risked a glance back and immediately regretted it. It was closer now, much closer. I could see the glint of its eyes behind the mask, filled with a primal hunger that chilled me to my core. Just when I thought I couldn't go on, I saw it, a break in the trees ahead. I put on a final burst of speed, hope giving me strength I didn't know I had. I burst out of the forest and found myself at the edge of a cliff. Below, a river rushed by, its waters dark and churning. For a moment, I stood frozen, caught between two impossible choices. The crunch of leaves behind me made the decision for me. Without allowing myself to think, I jumped. The fall seemed to last forever. The wind rushed past me, drowning out everything else. Then I hit the water, the cold shocking the air from my lungs. The current was strong, pulling me under and tossing me about like a rag doll. I fought my way to the surface, gasping for air. As I was swept downstream, I looked back at the cliff. The figure stood at the edge, watching me. It made no move to follow. I don't know how long I was in the water. It felt like hours. By the time I managed to drag myself onto the riverbank, I was miles from where I'd started, battered, bruised, and half drowned. I stumbled through the woods, disoriented and exhausted, until I finally came across a road. A passing motorist took one look at my bedraggled state and drove me straight to the nearest police station. The authorities were skeptical of my story at first. A masked killer in the woods sounded like something out of a horror movie. But when they investigated and found the abandoned campsite, complete with signs of violence and the backpack with the hand, they changed their tune. A massive manhunt was launched, but they never found the masked figure. They did, however, uncover a series of unsolved disappearances in the area going back decades. Hikers and campers who had vanished without a trace, their cases gone cold long ago. I gave statements, looked at photos of missing persons, but in the end, there was little I could tell them. The mask had hidden any identifying features, and in my panic, details had become blurred. It's been years since that day, and I've never gone hiking alone again. The woods, once a place of solace and adventure for me, now fill me with a deep, primal fear. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig, sends my heart racing. Sometimes, in my dreams, I'm back in that forest, running, always running, with the masked figure right behind me. I wake up in a cold sweat, the memory of those hungry eyes still fresh in my mind. The police tell me it's over, that I'm safe now. But I know the truth. Out there, in the deep woods where the trails end and silence reigns, something waits. Something that has tasted human fear and flesh and hungers for more. And so I stay away from the forests, content with city parks and well-traveled paths. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I wonder, how many more will vanish before the truth is known? How many more will meet the silent hunter of the woods, never to return? I alone escaped. I alone can tell the tale. But who would believe the story of an abandoned campsite, a masked figure, and a desperate plunge into churning waters? So I keep my silence, and I stay away from the woods, and I pray that others will be wise enough to do the same. The moment I heard the laughter echoing through the empty mall, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. Night security was supposed to be an easy job, quiet, uneventful. But as I stood frozen in the darkened food court, flashlight beam trembling, I realized this night was going to be anything but ordinary. I'd taken the job at Westfield Mall about a month ago. Fresh out of college with a useless degree in philosophy, I was desperate for any work I could find. When I saw the ad for a night security guard, it seemed perfect. Decent pay, quiet nights where I could study for grad school, and best of all, no customer service. The first few weeks were exactly what I'd expected. I'd make my rounds, check the locks, and spend the rest of the night reading or watching videos on my phone. The massive, empty mall was eerie at first, but I quickly got used to the silence and the shadows. But tonight was different. I sensed it the moment I walked in for my shift. The air felt heavy, charged with a strange energy that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to too much caffeine and not enough sleep. My first round was uneventful. All doors secure, no signs of break-ins or vandalism. I was just settling in at my desk in the security office when I heard it. A soft thud, like something heavy being knocked over, coming from the direction of the department store. I sighed, figuring some merchandise had probably fallen off a shelf. It happened sometimes, especially if things weren't stacked properly. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out to investigate. The beam of light cut through the darkness as I made my way through the silent corridors. The mall always looked different at night. The cheerful storefronts transformed into gaping black mouths, mannequins casting long, distorted shadows. I'd gotten used to it, or so I thought. As I approached the department store, that uneasy feeling returned. Stronger now. Something felt off, though I couldn't put my finger on what. I swept my flashlight across the store entrance, seeing nothing out of place. That's when I heard the giggle. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakably the sound of a child laughing. I froze, my heart suddenly pounding. There shouldn't be anyone else here, especially not a kid. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty space. "Is someone there? This is security. The mall is closed." No response, just silence. I stepped into the store, my flashlight beam dancing across racks of clothes and shelves of merchandise. Everything looked normal, undisturbed. I was starting to think I'd imagined the sound when I saw it. A flash of movement at the edge of my light. I whirled around, but there was nothing there. Just more empty aisles and silent displays. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. "You're freaking yourself out over nothing," I muttered. But then I heard it again. The laugh, louder this time, coming from the back of the store, and with it, the unmistakable sound of running feet. My training told me to call for backup, to not engage with potential intruders alone. But curiosity and a sense of duty propelled me forward. What if it really was a lost kid? I couldn't just leave them here. I made my way deeper into the store, past the perfume counter with its ghostly bottles, through the forest of coat racks. The sound of feet grew louder, always just ahead of me, always just out of sight. "Please," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to help. Are you lost?" A giggle answered me, closer now. I spun around and caught a glimpse of something ducking behind a display. It was small, child-sized, but something about its movement was off. Too fluid, too quick. My heart was racing now, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I pressed on, rounding the display. "Got you," I said, more to reassure myself than anything. But there was nothing there, just an empty space where a child should have been. That's when the laughter erupted all around me. Not just one voice now, but many. The sound of running feet multiplied, coming from every direction. Shadows darted at the edge of my vision, always vanishing when I tried to focus on them. Panic set in, I turned to run, only to find my path blocked by a rack of clothes that hadn't been there before. I pushed through it, hangers clattering to the floor, and sprinted for the exit. But the store had changed. Aisles twisted in impossible ways. Familiar landmarks were in all the wrong places. It was like being in a funhouse mirror maze, everything distorted and wrong. The laughter grew louder, more frenzied. I could feel them all around me now, unseen presences closing in. My flashlight began to flicker, the beam growing weaker. Just as I thought I was hopelessly lost, I saw it, the exit sign, glowing faintly in the distance. I ran towards it, my lungs burning, the cacophony of laughter reaching a fever pitch behind me. I burst out of the store and slammed the security gate down behind me. The laughter cut off abruptly, leaving me in sudden, ringing silence. I stood there for a long moment, gasping for breath, my whole body shaking. Slowly, I turned around, half expecting to see a horde of ghostly children pressed against the gate. But there was nothing. The store beyond was dark and still, showing no signs of the chaos I'd just experienced. On shaky legs, I made my way back to the security office. I thought about calling the police, but what would I tell them? That I'd been chased by invisible laughing children. They'd think I was crazy or on drugs. I spent the rest of my shift huddled in the office, jumping at every sound. When morning came and the first employees started to arrive, I'd never been so glad to see another human being. I gave my notice that day. No job was worth what I'd experienced. But as I was leaving, something made me take one last look at the department store. And there, in the window, I saw them. A group of child-sized mannequins arranged in a perfect circle. They hadn't been there the night before. I was sure of it. And call me crazy, but I could have sworn one of them winked at me. I ran out of the mall and didn't look back. It's been years since that night, and I've never set foot in a mall after dark again. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I think I hear a faint giggle or the patter of small feet. But I tell myself it's just my imagination, a remnant of that terrifying night. But deep down, I know the truth. There are things in this world that can't be explained, things that lurk in the shadows of empty buildings and come out to play when the lights go out. And sometimes, if you're very unlucky, you might just encounter them. So if you ever find yourself alone in a mall at night, and you hear the sound of children laughing, run, and don't look back. Because they're not children, and they're not laughing with you. They're laughing at you, and if they catch you, well, let's just say you might end up joining their eternal game of hide and seek. As for me, I work days now, in a small office with lots of windows and people around, and I always leave before dark. The crack of thunder that shook our car was nothing compared to the chill that ran down my spine when we saw the silhouette of the old house looming through the rain. We needed shelter, but as we approached the seemingly abandoned building, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into something far worse than the storm. It was supposed to be a fun family road trip. My wife, Sarah, our 2 kids, Ethan, 10, and Lily, 8, and I had set out early that morning, excited for a week at the beach. The first few hours were great, sing-alongs, car games, and the anticipation of sun and sand. But as we entered the more rural part of our journey, the sky darkened ominously. Within minutes, we were in the middle of the worst storm I'd ever seen. Rain lashed against the windshield, making it nearly impossible to see. The wind howled, rocking our small SUV. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to keep us on the road. Sarah sat tensely beside me, while the kids had gone quiet in the back, their earlier excitement replaced by fear. "Maybe we should pull over," Sarah suggested, her voice tight with worry. I nodded, already looking for a safe spot. That's when our engine made a sputtering sound and the car began to slow. No, I muttered, guiding the now powerless vehicle to the side of the road. We rolled to a stop just as the engine died completely. For a moment, we sat in silence, the sound of rain drumming on the roof. Then Lily's small voice piped up from the back. "Daddy, what's happening?" I turned to give her a reassuring smile. "It's okay, sweetheart. The car's just taking a little break. We'll be fine." But as I tried to restart the engine, my confidence wavered. It wouldn't turn over. We were stranded in the middle of nowhere, in a raging storm, with two scared kids. That's when Sarah spotted it. "Look," she said, pointing through the rain-streaked window. "Is that a house?" I squinted, following her gaze. Sure enough, set back from the road was a large, old house. It was hard to make out details through the rain, but it looked like it had seen better days. "Should we?" Sarah asked, leaving the question unfinished. I hesitated. On one hand, approaching a strange house in the middle of nowhere went against every horror movie rule I knew. On the other, we couldn't stay in the car indefinitely, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. "We don't have much choice," I finally said. "Let's go." We made a dash for it, Sarah carrying Lily while I held Ethan's hand. By the time we reached the porch, we were soaked to the bone. I raised my hand to knock, then paused. The paint on the door was peeling, and the porch creaked ominously under our feet. This place didn't look like it had been lived in for years. "Hello?" I called out, knocking loudly. "Is anyone home? We're stranded and need help." No answer. I tried the door handle, and to my surprise, it turned easily. The door swung open with a long, eerie creak. "Should we go in?" Sarah whispered, clutching Lily closer. I nodded reluctantly. "We need to get out of this storm. Hello?" I called again as we stepped inside. "We're coming in. We don't mean any harm. We just need shelter." The interior of the house was as run down as the outside. Dust covered every surface, and sheets draped what I assumed was furniture. The air was stale and musty. "This place gives me the creeps," Ethan muttered, pressing closer to my side. "It's just an old house," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Let's see if we can find some candles or a flashlight." We moved deeper into the house, our wet shoes leaving tracks in the thick dust. The living room was large and with a grand fireplace dominating one wall. Faded portraits hung on the walls, their subjects' eyes seeming to follow us as we moved. "Look," Sarah said, pointing to a door off to the side. "That might be the kitchen. There could be some supplies in there." I nodded, and we made our way over. The kitchen was as abandoned as the rest of the house, but we managed to find some old candles and matches in a drawer. Soon we had a bit of light to see by. Light too. "Why don't you kids sit here?" Sarah said, brushing off a sheet-covered couch. "Dad and I will see if we can find some dry clothes or blankets." The kids nodded, huddling together on the couch. I could see they were scared, but they were trying to be brave. Sarah and I headed upstairs, the old steps groaning under our weight. The second floor was a long hallway with several doors leading off it. We started checking rooms, looking for anything useful. In what looked like a master bedroom, we found an old wardrobe with some musty but dry clothes. "It's better than nothing," Sarah said, gathering an armful. As we were about to leave the room, I heard it. A soft thud, like footsteps, coming from downstairs. Sarah froze. "The kids?" I shook my head. The sound was too heavy to be Ethan or Lily. We hurried back downstairs, my heart pounding. But when we reached the living room, the kids were exactly where we'd left them. "Did you hear that?" I asked them. They shook their heads, looking confused. "Hear what, Dad?" Ethan asked. I was about to explain when we heard it again. Definitely footsteps, and definitely not coming from any of us. They seemed to be coming from above us now. "There's someone else in the house," Sarah whispered, her face pale. I tried to think rationally. Maybe it's the owner. They could help us. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The footsteps didn't sound normal. They were too heavy, too deliberate. "Kids, come here," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. They hurried over, and we huddled together, listening. The footsteps moved across the ceiling, then stopped at the top of the stairs. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, the steps began to descend. Thud, thud, thud. Each step seemed to take an eternity. We stood frozen, watching the staircase, waiting to see what would appear. But nothing did. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs and then silence. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. "Is someone there?" No response. Just the sound of the rain outside and our own rapid breathing. Suddenly, all the candles went out at once, plunging us into darkness. Lily screamed, and I felt Ethan's grip on my hand tighten. That's when we saw it. A faint glow, coming from the hallway. It was moving towards us, accompanied by those heavy footsteps. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing the kids and making a dash for the front door. But it wouldn't open. The handle turned, but the door seemed sealed shut. The glow was getting closer. In its light, I could see strange symbols carved into the walls, symbols that definitely hadn't been there before. "The back door!" Sarah yelled, pulling us towards the kitchen. We ran, the glowing presence right behind us. I could feel its cold breath on my neck, hear its raspy breathing. We burst into the kitchen and Sarah yanked open the back door. We tumbled out into the rain, not stopping until we reached our car. As I fumbled with the keys, I looked back at the house. There, in every window, were faces, pale, translucent faces, watching us with hollow eyes. And in the doorway stood a figure, tall and impossibly thin, bathed in that eerie glow. The engine roared to life. Whatever had been wrong with it before was miraculously fixed. I slammed the car into drive and peeled away, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. We drove in silence for a long time, the rain eventually giving way to clear skies. It wasn't until we saw signs of civilization that anyone spoke. What was that place?" Ethan asked, his voice small. I shook my head, meeting Sarah's eyes. We silently agreed. The kids didn't need to know the full extent of what we'd seen. "Just an old house, buddy," I said, trying to sound casual. Probably some local kids playing a prank. But I knew, and I think Sarah knew too, that what we'd encountered was something far more sinister. Something that had been waiting for unsuspecting visitors. Something that had nearly trapped us in its web. We never did make it to the beach that year. Somehow, none of us felt much like a vacation anymore, and to this day, whenever we pass an old abandoned house, we drive a little faster, hold each other a little closer, and silently thank whatever luck or fate that allowed us to escape that stormy night. The first phone call came at 9:17 p.m. "I see you sitting there in that ratty old armchair," the voice said. I laughed it off as a prank. By the third call, when the voice described the book in my hands and the coffee stain on my shirt, laughter was the furthest thing from my mind. Someone was watching me, and I was trapped in a house where every door was suddenly locked from the outside. It was supposed to be a relaxing week. My friend Jake had asked me to house sit while he and his family went on vacation. Their home was in a quiet, upscale neighborhood, the kind of place where nothing ever happens. I'd jumped at the chance for a change of scenery, imagining days of peaceful reading and nights of uninterrupted sleep. The first 2 days were exactly that. I'd settled into a comfortable routine, enjoying the luxury of Jake's home theater system and well-stocked kitchen. By the third day, I was more relaxed than I'd been in months. That evening, I'd curled up in Jake's favorite armchair with a book I'd been meaning to read for ages. The house was quiet, save for the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the occasional turn of a page. It was perfect. Then the phone rang. I almost didn't answer it. Jake hadn't mentioned expecting any calls, and I figured it was probably a telemarketer. But on the fourth ring, I set my book aside and picked up the landline. "Hello?" "I see you sitting there in that ratty old armchair," a voice said. It was deep, slightly distorted, like someone speaking through a voice changer. I chuckled, assuming it was one of Jake's friends playing a prank. "Very funny. Who is this?" The line went dead. Shaking my head, I returned to my book, but I couldn't focus on the words. Something about that call had unsettled me. How did they know about the armchair? 15 minutes later, the phone rang again. Against my better judgment, I answered. "That book looks interesting," the voice said, "though I'd have thought you'd be more careful with your coffee." I froze. I'd spilled a few drops of coffee on my shirt earlier, leaving a small stain, but there was no way anyone could know that unless... I jumped up, scanning the room. Were there cameras hidden somewhere? Was someone watching through the windows? "Who is this?" I demanded. "What do you want?" "Just enjoying the show," the voice replied, then hung up. My heart was pounding now. This wasn't a prank. Someone was watching me, knew what I was doing. But how? I did a thorough search of the living room, looking for anything out of place and any sign of hidden cameras. Nothing. The curtains were drawn, so no one could be seeing in from outside. I was about to convince myself I was overreacting when the phone rang a third time. With shaking hands, I answered. "You won't find anything," the voice said, sounding amused. "But don't stop looking. It's entertaining." "Listen," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know who you are or what you want, but I'm calling the police." "No, you're not," the voice replied calmly. "Because all the doors are locked? And your cell phone? Check your pocket. It's not there anymore, is it?" Ice flooded my veins as I patted my pocket. My phone was gone, but that was impossible. It had been there just minutes ago. I ran to the front door, twisting the handle. It didn't budge. Same with the back door and every window I tried. Somehow, impossibly, I was locked in. "What do you want?" I shouted, panic rising in my throat. "Like I said," the voice chuckled, "I'm just enjoying the show. Sleep tight." The line went dead. I spent the next hour trying every door and window, searching for my phone, looking for any way to contact the outside world. Nothing worked. It was as if the house itself had turned against me, sealing me in. As the night wore on, the phone would ring periodically. Sometimes the voice would describe what I was doing. Sometimes it would make cryptic comments about my past, things no stranger should know. Each call left me more terrified than the last. I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every shadow, sent my heart racing. I kept expecting someone to step out of the darkness, to reveal themselves as my tormentor. But I remained alone, yet constantly watched. By morning, I was a wreck. Exhausted, terrified, and no closer to understanding what was happening. The calls had stopped around dawn, but that almost made it worse. The silence felt oppressive, expectant. I jumped at a sudden noise, only to realize it was my stomach growling. I hadn't eaten since the night before. Cautiously, I made my way to the kitchen. As I opened the refrigerator, the phone rang. I stared at it, debating whether to answer. On the fourth ring, I gave in. "Breakfast time, is it?" the voice said cheerfully. "Better make it a good one. You'll need your strength." "Please," I said, hating the tremor in my voice. "Just tell me what you want." "Money? I can get you money." "Oh, this isn't about money," the voice replied. "This is about justice. This is about making you feel what she felt." "She?" I asked, confused. "Who are you talking about?" "You know who," the voice growled, all pretense of friendliness gone. "You left her there alone and afraid, and now it's your turn." The line went dead, leaving me more confused and frightened than ever. Who was she? What did the voice think I'd done? As the day wore on, I oscillated between panic and determination. I tried to break windows, to pry open doors, even to break through walls. Nothing worked. It was as if the house was made of steel beneath its suburban exterior. The calls kept coming, each one more menacing than the last. The voice seemed to take pleasure in my fear, in my growing desperation. It would describe my futile attempts at escape in mocking detail, always one step ahead. By nightfall, I was nearing my breaking point. I hadn't slept in over 36 hours, hadn't eaten more than a few bites. The constant surveillance, the feeling of utter helplessness, was wearing me down. As I sat in the dark living room, jumping at every sound, a terrible thought occurred to me. What if no one came looking for me? Jake and his family weren't due back for days. I had no close family, no one who would miss me immediately. I could be trapped here for days, weeks even, at the mercy of this unseen tormentor. The phone rang, startling me out of my dark thoughts. "Figuring it out, are you?" the voice said, realizing that no one's coming to save you. That's how she felt. You know, alone, afraid, with no hope of rescue. "Please," I begged, beyond pride now. "I don't know who you're talking about. I haven't hurt anyone. This is a mistake." "No mistake," the voice replied coldly. "You left her to die, and now you'll share her fate. Enjoy your last night of sanity. Tomorrow, the real fun begins." The line went dead, and I broke down. Tears streamed down my face as I curled into a ball on the floor. What had I done to deserve this? Who did they think I was? As I lay there, my mind racing, a memory surfaced. A news story from years ago, about a young woman found dead in an abandoned house. They'd said she'd been trapped there for days before succumbing to dehydration. I remembered feeling horrified, wondering how no one had heard her cries for help. With a jolt, I realized why that memory had surfaced. The woman's name had been Cynthia, and she'd been Jake's sister. Suddenly, terribly, it all made sense. Jake's insistence that I house sit, the mysterious surveillance, the accusations of the voice. Somehow, Jake blamed me for his sister's death. But why? I'd never even met Cynthia. As if in response to my thoughts, the phone rang one last time. "Figured it out, have you?" Jake's voice said, no longer distorted. "Took you long enough. Don't worry, I'm not going to let you die in there. That would be too easy. No, tomorrow I'm coming home. And then you'll understand true fear." The line went dead, and I was left in silence. But now, that silence felt like the calm before a storm. Whatever Jake had planned, whatever he thought I'd done, I knew that when he walked through that door, my nightmare would only be beginning. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, I steeled myself. I may not understand why this was happening, but I was done being a passive victim. Whatever Jake had planned, I would face it head on. And somehow, some way, I would find a way to survive. The game was about to change, and I was determined to be ready. The moment we stepped into the abandoned hospital, I knew we'd made a terrible mistake. The air was thick with decay and something else, something that made my skin crawl. But it wasn't until we got separated, and I found that room with the still running medical equipment, that I realized we'd stumbled into a nightmare that was anything but abandoned. It was supposed to be a fun little adventure, a way to shake off the monotony of our boring summer break. There were 5 of us: me, my best friend Alex, his girlfriend Mia, and our friends Chris and Sarah. We'd heard rumors about the old St. Mary's Hospital on the outskirts of town, how it had been abandoned for years but was supposedly haunted. The perfect place for an afternoon of urban exploration and ghost hunting. We'd done our research, or so we thought. The hospital had closed down in the 90s due to budget cuts, and had been sitting empty ever since. There were the usual urban legends, ghostly patients, phantom screams in the night, but nothing too sinister. We figured, at worst, we'd scare ourselves silly and have some good stories to tell. The building loomed before us, a hulking mass of crumbling brick and broken windows. The main entrance was boarded up, but we found a side door that yielded to Alex's lock-picking skills. I didn't ask where he'd learned that particular talent. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alex announced with a flourish as the door creaked open, "welcome to St. Mary's House of Horrors." We all laughed, but there was an undercurrent of nervousness to it. Standing on the threshold, peering into the gloom beyond, I felt a sudden urge to turn back, but I squashed it down. I wasn't going to be the coward who chickened out. The interior was exactly what you'd expect from an abandoned hospital. Peeling paint, overturned gurneys, debris scattered everywhere. Our flashlight beams cut through the darkness, revealing glimpses of a world frozen in time. A nurse's station with moldering paperwork still on the desk. A waiting room with magazines from decades past strewn about. "This is so creepy," Mia whispered, clinging to Alex's arm. "Aw, is someone scared?" Chris teased, earning himself a glare from Mia. We moved deeper into the hospital, our excitement growing as we explored. We found an old operating theater, the table still in place, rusty instruments laid out as if waiting for a surgery that would never happen. In another room, we discovered a collection of old X-rays, the spectral images adding to the eerie atmosphere. It was when we reached the basement level that things started to feel off. The air grew colder, damper. Our voices echoed strangely in the narrow corridors, and there was a smell, antiseptic mixed with something metallic and unpleasant. "Guys," Sarah said, her voice tight, "maybe we should head back up. This place gives me the creeps." Part of me wanted to agree, but Alex was already forging ahead. "Come on, where's your sense of adventure? This is where all the good stuff is bound to be." We pressed on, but the feeling of unease grew with every step. The basement seemed to go on forever, a maze of identical corridors and locked doors. And then, we turned a corner and found ourselves facing a set of heavy double doors marked morgue. "Oh, hell no," Chris said, backing away. "I did not sign up for dead bodies." "They wouldn't leave bodies here," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "It's been abandoned for years, remember?" Alex pushed the doors open with a dramatic creak. "Only one way to find out." We stepped into the morgue, and that's when everything went to hell. The doors slammed shut behind us with a bang that echoed through the room. We all jumped, spinning around. "Very funny, Alex," Mia snapped. "Cut it out." But Alex was standing right next to her, looking as startled as the rest of us. "That wasn't me," he said. We tried the doors, but they wouldn't budge. It was as if they'd been welded shut. Panic started to set in as we realized we were trapped. "Okay, nobody panic," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's got to be another way out. Let's split up and look around. Yell if you find anything." In retrospect, splitting up was the worst decision I could have made, but fear doesn't always lead to clear thinking. I took the far corner of the morgue, my flashlight beam sweeping over rows of metal drawers. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. And then, I heard it, a soft whirring noise like machinery running. I followed the sound to a door I hadn't noticed before. It was slightly ajar, a faint light spilling out from inside. My hand trembled as I pushed it open. What I saw inside defied all logic. The room was spotlessly clean, a stark contrast to the decay outside, and it was filled with modern medical equipment, monitors beeping steadily, IV drips hanging, even what looked like a dialysis machine humming away in the corner. But it was what was on the bed that made my blood run cold. A figure lay there, hooked up to all the machines. It was covered in a sheet, but I could see the rise and fall of breathing. This wasn't a mannequin or a prop. This was a living person. I backed away, my mind reeling. This was impossible. The hospital was abandoned. Had been for years. So how? A hand clamped down on my shoulder, and I let out a scream that echoed through the morgue. I spun around to find Alex, his face pale in the dim light. "Jesus, you scared the crap out of me," I gasped. "Sorry," he said, but he wasn't looking at me. His eyes were fixed on the room behind me. "What the hell is this place?" Before I could answer, we heard a scream from somewhere in the morgue. It was Mia. We ran towards the sound, calling out for the others, but the morgue seemed to have changed. The layout was different, corridors twisting in ways they hadn't before. It was as if the very building was shifting around us. We found Sarah huddled in a corner, her eyes wide with terror. "There's someone here," she stammered. I saw them, in a doctor's coat, but their face, oh God, their face wasn't right. Chris was nowhere to be found. Neither was Mia. We called for them, our voices echoing mockingly back at us. The panic was full-blown now, turning our thoughts to static. That's when we heard the voice come crackling over an ancient PA system we hadn't noticed before. "Welcome, subjects. Your participation in our study is appreciated. Please remain calm as we begin the procedure." Ice flooded my veins. This wasn't a ghost story or an urban legend. This was something far worse. We ran, no longer caring about finding the others, just desperate to escape. But the morgue had become a labyrinth, every turn leading us back to where we started, and always, just at the edge of our vision, we'd catch glimpses of figures in doctors' coats, their faces hidden in shadow. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that nightmarish place. But eventually, miraculously, we found ourselves back at the entrance. The door that had been sealed shut now swung open at a touch. We burst out into the fading daylight, gulping in the fresh air. Without a word, we ran to Alex's car and peeled out of there, not stopping until we were miles away. We went to the police and, of course, told them about Mia and Chris, about the hidden room and the voice on the PA. They searched the hospital, but found nothing. No secret rooms, no modern equipment, and no sign of our missing friends. They were sympathetic but skeptical, suggested that maybe we'd gotten separated, that Mia and Chris had found their own way out, that the stress and the dark had played tricks on our minds. But I know what I saw, what I heard. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that voice. Your participation in our study is appreciated. And I wonder about Mia and Chris, about the figure under the sheet, about what's really going on in that abandoned hospital. We never went back, never spoke about it to anyone else. Who would believe us? But sometimes I catch Alex or Sarah looking at old news articles about the hospital, about missing persons reports from over the years. And I know they're wondering the same thing I am. What if it wasn't abandoned after all? What if, behind those crumbling walls, something is still very much alive and active? And what if, someday, they decide they need more subjects for their study? I keep telling myself it was just a shared delusion, a trick of fear and darkness. But deep down, I know the truth. And I know that somewhere out there, in that hospital that's not as abandoned as it seems, a nightmare is still unfolding. And there's nothing I can do to stop it.